Chapter 598, Count Jingon, 1. She really hoped He Changdi hadn't heard that. Unfortunately, He Sanlang's senses were too darn sharp. Chu Lian turned her body slightly and peeked up at him, blushing. She only managed to catch the defined line of his jaw before she quickly hunkered back down and shut her eyes. She gripped the purse hanging at her waist tightly with her hands. Her body started to tremble. He Sanlang pulled Chu Lian into his embrace easily. Her back was pressed right against his muscled chest, and she could feel it moving as he breathed. He Changdi's gaze wandered downwards. From this angle, he could see the trembling of Chu Lian's lashes. A smile curved on his lips. His slender fingers made quick work of the button near her collar and traveled further down. Wherever his hand trailed, buttons popped open in his wake. 1, 2. When all the buttons of Chu Lian's jacket were undone, the white undershirt she wore underneath was revealed. Chu Lian was paralyzed by her shyness. Her eyes were shut tight as He Sanlang's fingers continued working. Her white undershirt was now open, leaving her daisy-colored breastband exposed. 2 soft lumps were barely visible under the thin, plum tree-embroidered fabric. He Changdi's even breathing sped up as his pupils dilated. He couldn't resist covering one of the lumps with his palm and squeezing a little. Chu Lian had her eyes shut, so she couldn't see anything, but her other senses had become clearer as a result. She could feel the layers of her clothing being peeled away. She could feel the hot puffs of breath washing over her. Her bashfulness overcame her. He Sanlang took an arduous gulp. His fingers pulled away the last barrier between them. The snowy peaks topped with enticing red plums came into his view. His wife's pale skin looked even more beautiful when contrasted against her clothes. However, the peak on the left was slightly reddened. Of course, it was the one he had accidentally bumped into. Chu Lian's skin was tender and fragile. It was easy to leave marks on it. She was clumsy and didn't take much care, so there was always a small jar of bruise balm in the room. The bruise balm had been made personally by great Dr. Miao, so its effects went without saying. He Changdi suppressed the growing desire in him. He shut his eyes and took some bruise balm onto his palm before carefully applying it to the swollen part of Chu Lian's chest. Chu Lian could feel his movements, and her eyes fluttered open in surprise. Here she had been thinking bad things about him, when he was only being a gentleman. She pressed her lips together. However, when she looked down and watched what He Changdi was doing to her exposed chest, with her shirt open, the blush that had just faded returned in full force. Although He Changdi kept a serious expression on his face, his hands weren't as well behaved. He didn't go overboard, though. After applying the balm, he immediately started buttoning Chu Lian's clothes back up. Once her clothes had been straightened out, the flush on Chu Lian's cheeks finally retreated. She buried her face into He Sanlang's chest without a word. "Don't you have any questions for me?" He Changdi smiled and stroked her back. Chu Lian pushed him away and looked up to admire the nice line of He Changdi's jaw. "Why did you come to Qingxi Hall so abruptly?" He Changdi had appeared right in the nick of time, just when she had been put on the spot by eldest madam. It was too much of a coincidence. Furthermore, He Changdi usually wouldn't return from the Ministry of War that early. "You were being bullied so badly. How could I not return?" Chu Lian frowned. She didn't believe his joking tone. As expected, He Sanlang tenderly stroked her smooth cheek. "Then," he sighed and said, "I knew that Aunt wouldn't let you off after finding out that you went to Prince Weiss' estate, so I had someone watch her movements. The moment anything happened, they came to inform me." That was how he had been able to arrive at the right moment. Chu Lian was touched. He had been even more considerate than she had expected. She had been pushed to the brink today. Otherwise, she wouldn't have insulted him right to her face in front of the matriarch. Now it all depended on the matriarch. If the matriarch's eyes opened and saw the situation for what it was, then she might be safe. If the matriarch remained muddle-headed, however, then all the blame would fall upon her. Even if He Changdi stood by her then, it wouldn't be of any help. The Great Wu dynasty was built on the foundations of filial piety, so the law wouldn't be on her side. Chu Lian told him what happened when she had gone to Prince Weiss' estate today. "Princess Wei agreed to help us stop grandmother's token from reaching the palace. Princess Wei won't let anything through, so we can rest easy on that front." He Changdi saw that there was a mix of naivete and cunning in his bewitching wife's eyes, so he couldn't resist bending down to steal a kiss from her lips. He let out a low chuckle and said, "I feel that Princess Wei treats you rather well." Chu Lian didn't find it strange. Princess Wei treats me well because I saved Royal Princess Duanjia that one time, and we became friends later. He Sanling smoothed over his wife's soft locks, smiling all the while. What he left unsaid was that Princess Wei hadn't had any connection to Chu Lian in their past life. Royal Princess Duanjia didn't even know her then. When they had met with Prince Wei and his wife one time, the couple had clearly shown disdain and contempt towards Chu Lian due to the rumors around her. However, things were completely different in this life. The one who was the most different was the wife in his arms. Chapter 599, Count Jingon 2. The more they interacted, the more he Changdi would find the differences she had from their past life. Other than the face that he would never forget, there was nothing similar about the person in his arms to the Chu Lian in his memories. She didn't have any of the poisonous treachery that ran in the past Chu Lian. She wasn't cowardly, and she was brimming with confidence and talent. A shadow passed over He Changdi's eyes. The current Chu Lian seemed to have been made for him. He closed his eyes and opened them again, his magnetic voice ringing in Chu Lian's ears as he called, "Lianer?" Chu Lian looked up in response and blinked. She didn't understand why He Changdi had suddenly called out to her. When he met with those clear eyes, the heart that had leaped into his throat finally sunk back down into his chest. Sometimes, he was still overcome with fear, as if the current Chu Lian would suddenly turn back into the wicked woman of the past. Chu Lian didn't know of the inner struggle that He Changdi was facing. She tilted her head to the side and asked, "What's wrong? What's with that grimace on your face?" He Sanlang suddenly hugged her tight, pressing her close to his skin. He buried his head into her neck and took deep breaths of Chu Lian's special scent. He said, "Lianer, promise me this. Don't ever leave me, okay?" Chu Lian found it strange that He Changdi was suddenly spouting such tender words. She just took it as part of his unpredictable moods and returned the hug by wrapping her arms around his waist. As if she was placating a small child, she said, "All right, I promise," as if Chu Lian would really remain by his side and never leave with that promise alone. He Changdi's heart relaxed. He continued cuddling and kissing his wife. In a short moment, the kisses led to something else. After a day, Matriarch He's Jade Token was sent back from the palace. There wasn't any movement in Qingxi Hall this time. He Sanlang and Chu Lian thought that things had been settled for now. Who could have expected that He Dalong would suddenly kneel down before Matriarch He and declare his intent to take Pan Yanjin as his wife the very next day? Chu Lian and He Changdi were shocked beyond words by this news. Their first reaction was to order the servants not to let the news spread to Countess Jingon. If she were to find out about this, she would definitely fall even more ill. By then, her illness would turn incurable. He Sanlang and his wife hurried over to Qingxi Hall. When they reached the parlor, they could see He Dalong kneeling in front of the matriarch, while He Ying and her daughter were seated to one side without any readable expressions. Pan Nianzhen's complexion was ashen, and her head was bowed. This was the first time Chu Lian had seen her since that incident. She had become thinner. Even the knuckles of her hands, which were gripping a handkerchief tightly in her lap, had become more defined. Chu Lian frowned slightly. Pan Yanjin looked like a poor little bunny who had been bullied, like a white lotus flower that had been beaten down by a storm. However, Chu Lian didn't believe in judging her by her cover. Ever since she had met this cousin, she knew that she wasn't as cowardly and frail as her appearance might suggest. Furthermore, He Dalong had been sorry and guilty for the incident, but he had never thought of marrying Pan Yanjin. How had his decision changed in just the span of a few days? Matriarch He had already given up on having He Dalong marry Pan Yanjin after Chu Lian's provoking words. He was the eldest son of the house after all, and he was meant to hold up the house on his shoulders. The old count had risked his life on the battlefield to earn this noble title and build up House Jingon. She couldn't let it all go to ruin in her hands. Even if her daughter continued complaining, she would have had Pan Yanjin become one of Dalong's concubines at most. He Changdi and Chu Lian could hear the matriarch gravely demanding, "Dalong, what did you just say? Say it again." Eldest brother He Changqi had lost weight. His clothes hung loosely on his frame now, and his chin was covered in stubble. His bloodshot eyes added to his frail appearance. If not for the same, familiar features on his face, Chu Lian wouldn't have dared to recognize him as her brother-in-law. He Changqi's voice was hoarse, but his words traveled clearly into everyone's ears. Grandmother, I will marry Pan Yinjin. I'll bear the consequences of my actions. You. Matriarch He pointed at her eldest grandson, anger building in her without any outlet. He Changdi followed by saying, Grandmother, I'll send a petition to the emperor to take away my position as heir and give it to second brother instead. Once I marry Pan Yinjin, I'll take her back to our ancestral home. Chu Lian was astounded. She immediately understood that eldest brother wasn't trying to make a compromise. He had completely given up on overturning the situation. He was trying to make it a loss on both sides to resolve the matter. This could protect House Jinggan's reputation, as well as preserve the relationship between Matriarch He and He Ying. He Changqi's words alarmed He Ying and her daughter. They were the ones who were the most shocked and scared by He Dalong's declaration. If He Changqi really did so, their plans would come to nothing. Pan Yinjin would have to give up on He Changdi and follow He Changqi into becoming a joke. Pan Yinjin raised her head, her face full of astonishment as she looked at He Changqi. The veins on her hands stood out as her grip on her handkerchief tightened. She couldn't believe that all of her efforts would come to waste. If she really had to marry He Changqi and leave the capital, then what difference was there between that and staying in Xiyang? As everyone in the parlor was frozen with shock, a loud roar rang out from the entrance with the presence of one who often commanded their troops. You little brat, do you dare to repeat what you just said to me? Chapter 600, Brother 1. When the man's rough bellow faded from the parlor, everyone turned their attention the entrance. Chu Lian turned in a slow, stunned manner, only to be met with the sight of a bearded, middle-aged man. He was dressed in a commander's silver armor with a sword at his waist. His figure was tall and buff, like a miniature mountain. He Ying was equally stunned. It took a long moment before she finally called out in a tiny voice, Brother. The stern expression on the matriarch faded away, replaced with unconcealed joy. She reached out to the side and senior servant Lu quickly supported her and helped her up. Before she had even walked up to the middle-aged man, the old matriarch's eyes had already turned red. She sounded on the verge of tears as she said, My son, you finally returned. Chu Lian finally realized that this middle-aged man who had suddenly appeared was her very own father-in-law. She had to say that eldest brother resembled Count Jinggan the most. Whether it was his figure or features, it was He Changqi who looked the most like Count Jinggan. A rare spark of respectful admiration shone in He Changdi's eyes when his gaze fell upon the Count. The worry that Chu Lian had held for He Dalong disappeared after she saw Count Jinggan. The novel had mentioned Count Jinggan before, and in that brief mention, Chu Lian knew that the Count was a smart, level-headed person. He had passed this trait down to He Changdi. While eldest brother He Changqi was sensible when it came to external problems, he became irrationally stubborn in matters concerning the family or relationships. Now that Count Jinggan was back, with someone pressuring He Dalong, perhaps only then would the Jinggan estate finally recover its peace. Chu Lian was still lost in her thoughts when her wrist was caught by He Sanlang, pulling her back to reality. She stared at her husband a little dazedly. He Changdi put on a helpless look before bending down to whisper into her ear, What's wrong? Are you scared? There's no need to be afraid. Father is very friendly and easy to get along with. When she heard his reassurance, she understood that He Changdi intended to bring her forward to greet the Count for the first time. The entire parlor of people stood up, some with uncertainty, some with wild joy, and some with disappointment. Count Jinggan was welcomed to the raised platform at the head of the room. One of the servants was about to help He Changqi up from his kneeling, but the Count immediately put a stop to it with a shout. Does he have the right to stand after doing such a terrible thing? Don't move. Let him kneel. Once the Count had spoken, no one dared to speak up for He Changqi any longer. Everyone looked at him with pity in their eyes. After Count Jinggan set down the order, his gaze swept over the people gathered in the parlor before landing on He Changdi and his wife. His fearsome, Tan Min immediately melted into a kind, caring look. He beckoned towards He Changdi and Chu Lian and said, "This must be Sanlang's wife. Come over here, you two." Chu Lian darted a quick glance at He Sanlang. Although she didn't show it on the surface, she was actually rather nervous inside. It was her first time meeting her father-in-law, after all. He Changdi returned a reassuring look and led her up to Count Jingon. After a short pause, Chu Lian greeted the Count together with He Changdi. "Father." Count Jingon, He Yinwen, took in the sight of his handsome son standing next to his beautiful, pleasant-looking wife. The couple seemed very loving in their interactions. His third son looked ready to defend his wife should anyone try to bully her, indicating that their relationship was going well. The remaining bit of blame he had towards his mother for pleading the Empress Dowager for an arranged marriage dissipated. Chapter 601. Brother 2. When he saw that Chu Lian was sneaking glances at him from time to time, her clear and innocent eyes full of curiosity and uncertainty, he burst out into laughter. He took out a green brocade purse from his waist and passed it to He Sanlang. "Take this. Since father wasn't around for Lianer's tea ceremony, this is a welcome gift to make up for it." Once Count Jingon set down the authoritative presence he had honed in the army, he was actually a very likable person. No wonder even the cold He Changdi held affection towards his father. He Changdi naturally wouldn't stand on ceremony with his own father. He took the purse and passed it to Chu Lian without looking. Humor could be heard from his tone as he said, "Lianer, open it and see what's inside. If father's gift isn't good enough, they'll ask him for more." Chu Lian looked askance at He Changdi before thanking Count Jingon. She was about to keep the purse without looking inside, but the Count stopped her. Smiling, he said, "Aren't you going to open it and see?" Since the gifter had said so, Chu Lian carefully opened up the purse and poured its contents onto her hand. When small, resplendent little gems fell onto her palm, Chu Lian could no longer hide the shock on her face. The purse actually contained more than 10 gems the size of pigeon eggs. Amongst them were the extremely rare red and pink diamonds. If these appeared in the modern world, they would literally be worth entire cities. Chu Lian hadn't expected her father-in-law to have given her such valuable gifts on their first meeting. She froze up while holding up the purse, not knowing what to do. She turned to look at He Changdi for help. He Sanlang understood the look in her eyes. He smiled and rubbed her hand to comfort her. "Since father has given them to you, just keep them. It's worth these few trifles to get you to call him father." Chu Lian wanted to roll her eyes. A few trifles. Could these fine red and pink diamonds really be called trifles? She shook her head helplessly in her mind and carefully poured the gems back into the purse. She made another deep bow in thanks to Count Jingon. "You must be tired from your travels, father. Daughter-in-law has no special talents, but daughter-in-law will personally cook a few dishes for father at tonight's reunion dinner." Count Jingon laughed openly once again. "Then father will look forward to trying Lianer's cooking tonight." Once the customs were done, He Changdi held his wife's hand and retreated to the side. Count Jingon didn't address his eldest son, who was still kneeling on the ground, and made some small talk with matriarchy instead. His gaze finally landed upon He Ying, who he hadn't seen in many years. His tone turned cold as he said, "Miss Ying, it's been a long time since we've last met, but you seem to be the same." There was ridicule in his words that made it clear he wasn't complimenting her appearance. He was mocking her for being up to her old tricks. It was bad enough that she had created a scandal for herself back then, but now she was doing the same with her daughter. Back then, the only one that He Ying had feared wasn't the old count or her mother, but her very own brother, He Yinwen. He Ying was both afraid and jealous of her brother. She had hated her brother for being able to follow their parents onto the battlefields. He had been taught personally by their parents. Later on, when he had grown up and married, she had hated him for being able to inherit their father's title, for being able to bring honor to their family. She hated her brother for having 3 sons, while she only had a failure of a daughter by her side, without any heirs to take care of her in her old age. Before Count Jingon had returned, she had been able to swagger about the estate with the matriarch's protection. She had been able to bully the younger members of the family and even her sister-in-law Countess Jingon. However, Now that her brother was back, she was instantly beaten down into the dust without her brother even trying. She didn't even have the courage to move anymore. Ying stood to one side with her daughter, her head low. She couldn't even look Count Jingon in the eyes, and instead, she let out a weak mumble, "Brother." It was Pan Niantin's first time seeing her mother so nervous, so she ended up getting affected as well. Her personality was a little cowardly in the first place, so she didn't dare to lift her head up now. In a frail voice, she said, "Uncle." Chapter 602. The Past is Dead, 1. Count Jingon harumphed, clearly disinclined to bother with He Ying and her daughter. It wasn't just He Ying and Miss Pan who felt extremely awkward because of that, but Matriarch He as well. He Ying and Miss Pan had been under her care and protection after all. Once everyone in the parlor had finished greeting Count Jingon, it was finally He Dalong's turn. He Changqi hadn't seen his father in years. He missed his father just as much as anyone else in the family, but he knew that it was his own fault that his father was coldly ignoring him now. Count Jingon finally cast his gaze upon his disappointing eldest son. Fury and frustration warred within him, and he ordered in a deep voice, "Follow me to the study." He Changqi stood up and followed the Count out of Qingxi Hall with his head bowed. Now that the Count had returned, the entire estate was bursting with joy. The news quickly spread to Countess Jingan's courtyard. The Countess disregarded her ailing health and immediately tried to get out of bed to see the husband she hadn't laid eyes upon for years. Luckily, He Changdi and Chu Lian arrived just in time to stop her. Otherwise, the Countess might have made her condition worse. The entire family gathered in the parlor in the outer court to have a reunion dinner at night. Even He Erlang returned to the estate early this day. The estate was bustling with noise and excitement, and it was even livelier that it was on New Year's Day. The dishes served for dinner were personally cooked by Chu Lian and her handmaids. There was fragrant stir-fried pork, spicy stir-fried beef, griddle shredded cabbage, poached fish slices, old duck soup. There were more than 10 dishes in total, and they were all things that Count Jingon had never eaten before. After the meal, he couldn't help but compliment his youngest daughter-in-law's cooking. Since his belly was now full with an extremely satisfying reunion dinner, Count Jingan's mood had become much better as compared to in the day, when he was dealing with the mess that Dalong had created. That night, Count Jingon led his 2 little granddaughters and his wife back to their courtyard. Within the main bedroom of Countess Jingan's courtyard, the servants had already retreated, leaving the couple to themselves. Their 2 granddaughters had been taken to bed by their nursemaids. Count Jingon took his wife's hand and led her to sit by the desk. The couple was very close and they hadn't met in many years, so they were full of longing. Right now, the 2 of them had much to say to each other. The Count was the most concerned about his wife's health. Although he had already received He Changdi's letter, stating that his wife's illness had been cured, he couldn't rest easy without seeing it for himself. Now that his previously bedridden and sickly wife was standing before him with healthy, ruddy cheeks, he was elated beyond belief. The burly middle-aged general's eyes reddened and he gripped his wife's hand. "Pei Wen, you're finally all better." Countess Jingon, Lu Pei Wen, smiled along with her husband. "Yes, I'm all better now. Those days when I was trapped in bed feel like a dream now. Tell me how the person who healed you is like." "Great Dr. Miao?" Count Jingon knew roughly how his wife had been cured, but he wasn't clear on the details involved. Countess Jingon knew that he would ask about it, so she explained the entire situation from start to end patiently. It took her a whole hour to finish explaining it all. She smiled as she looked at her husband. "It must be the heavens who couldn't bear seeing me lying in bed and helped to cure me earlier so I could welcome you back to our home." The Count chuckled and nodded. He lamented, "Sanlang's wife is really our He family's lucky star. If not for her, great Dr. Miao wouldn't have stayed in our estate so readily and helped to cure your illness. Although Mother is getting old and becoming more muddle-headed, she must have been guided by a greater power when she went to plead for this marriage for Sanlang. I'll go thank great Dr. Miao myself tomorrow." Countess Jingon nodded in agreement. "Yes, we should thank him personally." Immediately after, she seemed to have thought of something as she let out a giggle. "Husband, now that you mention it, Sanlang has been growing more and more ever since his wife married into our family. He's a marquis now. Could Sanlang's wife be a lucky star for her husband as well? Count Jingon burst out into laughter and reminded his wife, "Remember not to mention this out of our rooms. Let's just keep it as a joke between us. This kind of talk can't be spread outside, or it might draw disaster upon us." Now that the Count had returned, Countess Jingon had found her pillar of support once again. Her mind was now clearer than before. She hurriedly replied, "I understand." The two drank their tea together. When the Count noticed that his wife was looking at him as if she had something she didn't quite dare to say, he had a good guess at what she was keeping in. He sighed softly. Dalong is an honest and considerate child to the bone, and he's loyal to the family. It's not completely his fault that his marriage with Madame Zhou turned out this way. The two of them have already divorced now, so don't think too much about it. We have to take each day as it comes. As for He Ying's child, don't worry. As long as I'm here, he'll never approve of their marriage. Even if Dalong were to marry again, his second wife has to be a good and kindly lady. Otherwise, little N and little Lin will be the ones who'll suffer. Madame Lu hadn't expected her husband to have made a clear decision on the matter. A burden was lifted from her heart. She leaned against her husband's side as the tightly wound nerves in her heart relaxed. Chapter 603. The past is dead too. It was the 15th of the month today. A full moon was hanging in the sky, shining brightly and casting its light upon the estate. When the pale moonlight filtered through the half-opened window, it lit up a small area before their lounge. The old couple lifted their heads up to behold the moon outside the window, a sense of fulfillment warming their hearts. As they enjoyed this warm moment together, they didn't know that there had been a very different outcome in their past life. House Jingon had come to an end just 2 months later from this day. Back then, Countess Jingon had been bedridden from her old illness. The estate had been ransacked by imperial troops searching for evidence, and the matriarch had fallen ill and become bedridden as well. The Count had been arrested and publicly executed in the market, while the 3 He brothers had been sent off to exile in the north. That nightmarish ending was drifting further and further away from them now. He Changdi stood by the window, staring at the full moon hanging in the sky in a daze. The cool moonlight threw a bright silver cloak over He Sanlang, setting him aglow. He stood with his hands behind his back. The spring night breeze brushed over his skin, lifting up the 2 locks of hair by his face, making him look like a deity who had descended upon the earth. Chu Lian had woken up in the middle of her sleep from thirst. When she opened her eyes and found that her personal heat source had disappeared, she sat up dazedly. She pushed aside the gauze bed curtains and looked towards the outside. There was only a single dim lamplit in the room, so Chu Lian spotted He Changdi immediately under the light of the moon. She found it strange that her husband was standing at the window in the middle of the night and in such thin clothes. It was spring, so the nights were still cold. She slipped her feet into her night slippers and took up He Changdi's cloak from one corner. She walked up to him and tiptoed to place the cloak around his shoulders. "It's so late. Why aren't you sleeping?" Chu Lian's sleep-addled voice was slightly hoarse. The usual wit and clarity in her almond-shaped eyes had given way to a misty sleepiness. He Sanlang felt something warm on his shoulders. That warmth seemed to seep from his chest directly into his heart, making his chilled heart beat faster. He suddenly reached out and tucked Chu Lian under his arms. He bent down slightly and asked gently, "Why are you awake?" His dear wife slept like a log on most days. Even earthquakes wouldn't be able to wake her up. Chu Lian wasn't totally awake yet. Her eyes were fighting to stay open. Thus, she simply leaned on her husband and put her head against his chest. She mumbled, "I was thirsty when I woke up. I saw that you weren't in bed, so I came to look for you." He Sanlang noticed that his wife's head was bobbing as she spoke, seemingly about to fall back asleep on the spot. The corner of his lips curled up helplessly. The dark mood he had been in was completely swept away by his wife's adorable appearance. He kissed the top of her head. "You're still sleepy?" Chu Lian's consciousness was already slipping away. She wrapped her arms tighter around He Sanlang's narrow waist. "Slee, py." He Sanlang resisted the urge to chuckle. "Didn't you get up for water?" Right after he finished speaking, he realized that Chu Lian had already nodded right off while bound tightly to his waist. This little troublemaker. He Changda's heart was filled at once with both sweetness and helplessness. Having this little woman in his arms, he felt like he was raising a spoiled little daughter. He Changdi bent down and moved Chu Lian's grip around his waist up to his neck instead. His palms went under Chu Lian's pert bottom, and he lifted her up like a child. Chu Lian was still leaning against his chest, unaware of her surroundings now. He Changdi spared one hand to pinch her flushed cheeks before turning and walking over to the bed. He set her down on the bed and pulled the cover over her to keep her arm. Instead of blowing out the lamp and getting into bed himself, he walked over to the desk in the room. He set a small cup of cold water on the little clay stove and waited for it to warm up. Once that was done, he took the warm teacup and brought it over to the bedside. He took a sip of water into his mouth and fed it to Chu Lian with a kiss. The sleeping woman subconsciously gulped down the warm water in her mouth and inadvertently licked her lips. That little action made He Changda's pupils dilate. He took in a deep breath and turned around, setting the teacup down on the bedside table. He sat for a long moment before he finally sidled back under the bed covers and by Chu Lian's side. Out of habit, he reached over to tuck Chu Lian into his embrace. With his wife's familiar fragrance around him, He Changda's messy thoughts slowly calmed down. Although the fate of House Jinggan had been rewritten in this life, and he had been able to avoid many of the disasters that had befallen them in his past, even to the point of earning a noble title for himself, he couldn't help the inescapable worries popping up in his mind. He was worried that this was all just a dream, that when he awoke again, he would be faced with the cruel reality of his past life. It wasn't until he had Chu Lian in his arms, when he could feel her living, breathing body before him, that He Chang'i could be sure that all this was real. Once he had calmed down his chaotic emotions, sleepiness started taking over his mind. Chapter 604. The Past is Dead. 3. Even at this late hour of the night, within a room in Qingxi Hall, Mu Xiang remained wide awake. The door and the windows of the room were firmly shut, and there weren't any candles lit up in the room, making it pitch black. Mu Xiang sat fully dressed on her bed in the darkness, like a sinister, silent specter. She was still in a daze. She couldn't believe that Count Jinggan had returned earlier than expected. This wasn't what happened in her past life. Ever since the Count had returned, the situation she had been pushing the estate into was now ruined. It wasn't possible to use Matriarch He and He Ying to achieve her own motives now. She bit her lip and cursed Count Jinggan inwardly. In this dark and seemingly boundless place, her eyes were lit up with a fearsome and poisonous glow. She scratched at the brocade bedsheets under her, vowing to herself that she would get what she wanted, no matter how vicious she had to be. The next day, Count Jinggan, He Changjue, and He Changdi headed for the palace together. Since the Count had just returned to the capital, he had to attend court in the morning before going over to the Ministry of War to hand over his matters, transfer his token of authority, and so on. There was plenty to do. He had managed to return to the estate in time yesterday because he had secretly sneaked in some free time. Once Count Jinggan returned his token of authority, which gave him command over the troops in the south, he would be bestowed a slack position in the capital and enjoy his retirement. This was the usual way that most of the defender generals retired, so it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Qingjing Hall within the palace. Court had been dismissed by now. Count Jinggan had been summoned into Qingjing Hall alone. Since Count Jinggan had just returned from Mingzhou, and he was an important general who had defended the borders for decades, it wasn't strange that the Qingping Emperor had summoned him for a private conversation. Dressed in a military official's court outfit, the burly and large Count Jinggan stood like a mountain before the doors of Qingjing Hall. When Eunuch Wei came out to invite him in, the Count followed behind the eunuch carefully. A glint flashed through Count Jinggan's eyes while his head was bowed. His determination could be seen on the set of his brows. He took in a deep breath and lifted his head, his gaze landing upon that imperial yellow figure. Although the emperor was approaching 50, he remained clean-shaven. The men of the Great Wu didn't keep beards, so the emperor had followed that rule. The beardless emperor looked 5 to 6 years younger than his real age, making him look in his early 40s. However, Count Jingon was different. Although he was younger than the emperor by a year, his face had been weathered by hardship and there were a few strands of white in his hair, making him look much older. The wrinkles at the corners of his mouth were prominent. Adding on to that his beard, he looked a decade older than the emperor. Upon hearing the footsteps of the approaching count, the emperor looked up from the imperial reports and gazed upon Count Jingon. There was an unreadable look in the emperor's eyes. It wasn't appreciation towards a loyal subject, nor admiration. It was far from trust and gratitude as well. In a nutshell, it was a strange look. He Yinwen. It's been years since we last met. We hope you're doing fine. The Chengping emperor threw out these unexpected words with a straight face, causing his trusted attendant, Eunuch Wei, to tremble a little behind him. Count Jingon bowed his head and body slightly, giving the emperor an appropriate salute, not an inch more or less. Defender General of the South, He Yinwen, greets your majesty. Long live your majesty. The Chengping emperor's tone cooled down all of a sudden. Long live? He Yinwen, you had better drop all pretenses. If you truly wished for us to live a long life, then you wouldn't have done that in the past. Count Jingon had a bitter smile in his heart. As expected, despite the many years that had passed, the emperor hadn't forgotten that incident in the past. However, the past is dead. There was no way to return to that time again. Count Jingon sighed inwardly. This humble official will accept any punishment as your majesty wishes. The emperor flew into a rage upon seeing the count's unruffled appearance. The anger that he had been suppressing for years was instantly ignited, warping his mien beyond recognition. He shoved the extremely priceless jade Jingtai teapot off his desk, roaring furiously, He Yinwen, don't you assume that we don't dare to sentence you to death. If she hadn't pled mercy for you back then, we would have split into 1,000 pieces by now. Count Jingon lowered his eyes, but his burly body remained standing strong like a majestic mountain. He was a staunch and unyielding obstacle in the emperor's eyes. This humble official will accept any punishment as your majesty wishes. Chapter 605. Without a cheat. 1. If the emperor were younger, he might really have drawn the imperial sword by his side and executed Count Jingon with a single, mad blow. However, for the current 50-year-old ruler, he had already experienced multitudes more compared to his younger days. Having sat on the golden throne for decades, he had been transformed into a true regent. Most trivial matters would hardly shake him now. Thus, at the mention of the incident he regretted the most during his youth, he was able to keep his emotions under control and retain his rationality. The emperor's cold gaze pierced down from above. If looks could kill, then Count Jingon's body would likely have become riddled with holes like a sieve. Although the look in the emperor's eyes was terrifying, Count Jingon knew he couldn't back down at this moment. He had already stayed resolute for so many years. There was no other choice but to keep that secret to his grave. Very well, He Yinwen. What a good dog you are. You're still their dog, even after all these years. Like a dog, you can't change your nature of eating shit. Such crude words had fallen from the lips of the emperor. It was easy to imagine how furious he was. Count Jingon bore with the emperor's fury and knelt down silently. He bowed his head slightly and knelt with both knees on the mirror-like floor of Qingjing Hall. Even in this pose of obeisance, his back remained ramrod straight as a sign of his silent rebellion. The emperor could no longer sit still behind the imperial desk. He stood up and paced back and forth with his hands behind his back, his eyes blood-red from the force of his anger. He suddenly stopped and asked, He Yinwen, are you still unwilling to speak even now? Count Jingon made a cupped fist salute towards the emperor with his eyes cast downwards. Your Majesty, this humble official has nothing to say. Nothing to say. He Yinwen, you were Asun's senior brother. The two of you studied under the same teacher. She treated you like a real brother. Count Jingon pressed his dry lips together. Your Majesty, it's precisely because I am Asun's senior brother that I have to keep this secret. Good, good. How very good of you. You're living up to your name, my loyal defender general of the South. You're still loyal even till death. Count Jingon sighed inwardly. Your Majesty, So many years have passed. Why continue troubling yourself over this matter? Asun already passed away more than 10 years ago. She only wished the best for you. The impact of Count Jingan's words made the emperor tremble. His wavering body threatened to collapse, scaring eunuch Wei into stepping forward and holding him up. The emperor's lips pulled into a bitter smile. Even though he had already guessed years ago that Yi Sun was no longer in this world, when he received confirmation of his guess, his first reaction was still disbelief. But it's still difficult to bear the truth. I'm losing control. Eunuch Wei had no words for that. He simply stayed by the emperor's side in a show of silent support. Who could have thought that the esteemed emperor would also have painful moments like this? However, she ended up nodding a little hesitantly. The cool expression on He Changda's face had already melted like the first snows of spring. He sat closer to Chu Lian and pulled her into his arms. Aren't you normally so brave and bold? How did a silly bad dream scare you? Come talk to me. Tell me what happened in your dream. I'll let you know if it's really scary. Chu Lian went along willingly and leaned against his broad chest. Her gaze traveled far into the distance. She had dreamed of returning to the modern world just now. Everything that she had experienced in the Great Wu Dynasty had just been a dream, and her lunatic husband He Sanlang was no longer by her side. He Changdi waited patiently, but he didn't hear his wife speak. He looked down to see that her thick eyelashes were trembling, and that her face was a little pale. He reached out to hold her hand and found that it was ice cold. Are you feeling unwell? Chu Lian suddenly pulled her hand out from He Changda's hold and grabbed He Sanlang in a sudden hug. She buried her head into the front of He Changda's shirt. After a short moment, his wife's stifled and soft voice rang out. He Changdi, please, don't ever leave me. Chu Lian had never done something like that before. Her request was more like a declaration of love, causing He Changda's heart to warm. His eyes turned even more gentle, and he stroked his wife's back with his hand. Lianer, don't worry, I'll never leave you. Chu Lian pushed He Changdi away, only to press a forceful kiss onto his lips. He Sanlang was only dazed for an instant before he took over the kiss. There was a bubbling sense of happiness and excitement within him. He and Chu Lian had been married for so long, but he was always the one who initiated things. This was the first time that she was acting so passionate. Their clothes quickly fell to the floor as the sounds of lovemaking filled the room. This time, since Chu Lian had been the one to spark things off, He Sanlang was especially enthusiastic. They had 3 whole rounds before he finally let her off. When they were done, Chu Lian had already fallen asleep again out of exhaustion. He Changdi was only dressed in an azure sleep robe, his muscled chest bared to the air. His long, dark hair hung behind him with 2 locks resting on his shoulders. The casual and indolent look softened the icy aura around him, giving the handsome man more seductive charm. He Changdi stroked Chu Lian's flushed cheeks with his long fingers. His slightly calloused fingers trailed down her long eyelashes, her straight nose, her petal-like pink lips, before landing on her exquisite collarbones. He couldn't resist bending over to steal another kiss from his wife's lips, before shifting aside her sweat-soaked fringe. Perhaps his touch had tickled Chu Lian somehow. She wrinkled her brows and shifted her face to one side, trying to escape the ticklish sensations he had invoked on her skin. The corners of He Changda's lips lifted up and he chuckled softly. He carefully moved Chu Lian closer to him, before wrapping his arms around her petite body and shutting his dark eyes. Chapter 607. Without a cheat, 3. After an hour, He Changdi got up and headed to the study. He summoned Chu Lian's handmaids, senior servant Gue and senior servant Zhong for questioning. However, even Xian didn't know what Chu Lian was worrying about. She only knew that Chu Lian had been rather anxious these few days, but she had no clue what the root of it was. The moment He Changdi had stepped out of the bedroom, the seemingly asleep Chu Lian had opened her eyes. She blinked and looked up at the canopy above her dazedly. There was fear muddling her clear gaze. Yesterday had marked the end of the knowledge she had about the events in the Great Wu Dynasty. She had only read the book halfway, so she had no idea what was in store for her in the later half. This was the same as a sniper entering a foreign land losing their map and knowledge. The situation affected her mood, making her lose all sense of safety and letting her fears and insecurities take over. Chu Lian sucked in a deep breath. The lost look in her eyes slowly changed into one of determination. She believed that she would be able to live just as well even without her cheek guiding her. After letting go of the worries that had been burdening her, Chu Lian's mood became more relaxed. Thinking back over the past year, even though she had known about the events about to happen, Changdi had always acted out of her expectations. Not everything had gone according to the book's original plan either, and she hadn't been able to avoid the major events of the story. Thus, she had only been torturing herself for nothing with her thoughts and worries over the past few days. After her reflection, she realized that having foreknowledge of the future didn't make any difference anyway. It was good enough as long as she remained true to herself. Now that she had finally thought things through, she recalled how forward she had been with Changdi. Her face instantly flushed. She called out for a servant, and Wenqing entered. "Where's my husband?" Wenqing carefully looked over third young madam and found that her complexion was a rosy pink and that her almond-shaped eyes were curved into crescents. The handmaid understood that her master's mood had improved vastly. Her worry for her master vanished. When third young master had seen how unhappy third young madam had been, he looked like he was going to punish all the servants of Songtao court. Replying to third young madam, "Third young master is in the study. Would you like to go there?" Chu Lian thought for a moment and nodded. Wenqing helped her into a silver and red 5-layer full-length gown and specially picked out some matching pearl accessories for her hair, giving Chu Lian a clean and elegant appearance. Changdi was in the middle of some deep thinking with his eyes shut. He rubbed the jade ring on his thumb subconsciously as he did so. When he heard the sound of the door being opened, his eyes slowly fluttered open. To his surprise, Chu Lian entered the room. The smile on her face was like the sun, casting away the gloominess hanging over him. Changdi beckoned Chu Lian over, and she quickly walked up to him. "Why did you come over by yourself?" There weren't any open documents in front of Sanlang. The inkwell next to him was also dry, so it was clear that he wasn't in the middle of sorting out some official business. With a gentle tug of his arm, Changdi pulled Chu Lian onto his lap. Chu Lian made a token struggle before giving in to his wishes. Changdi was tall and long-limbed, whereas Chu Lian was much smaller in size. Sitting obediently in his lap, she looked like a cute little daughter instead. Sanlang wound a loose lock of her hair on his finger as he spoke to her in a low, magnetic voice. "What should we prepare as a gift for the Thousand Blessings Festival?" Chu Lian had been focused on her own thoughts over the past 2 days, so she hadn't given much thought to it. Now Changdi's question reminded her that the Emperor's birthday was approaching. It was the Emperor's 50th birthday this year, and even the Empress Dowager had ordered for a grand celebration to be held. The ranked noble ladies would have to enter the palace for the banquet. It wasn't just Changdi who had to prepare a gift. She had to prepare something in her capacity as honored Lady Genie as well. Chu Lian saw that he was frowning from contemplation, so she asked, "Do you have something in mind already?" Changdi put an arm around Chu Lian's slender waist, the corner of his mouth tilting upwards. "How about the Snow Mountain Mist Flower?" The Chengping Emperor ruled over the vast lands of the Great Wu. He didn't need money in the least, so their gifts had to be something more than just valuable. He and his wife weren't close to the Emperor at all and weren't certain of his likes and dislikes. Thus, they could only pick some interesting treasures as gifts. There was still a single flower left after using the rest of the Snow Mountain Mist Flowers for Countess Jingan's medicine. From what Great Dr. Miao had said, the Snow Mountain Mist Flowers were more precious than 100-year-old ginseng or lingzhi mushrooms. While they weren't so powerful as to be a cure-all, they were invaluable as the main ingredients to cure many deep-seated illnesses. This information had been passed down from Great Dr. Miao's teacher. Even the imperial physicians in the palace had no idea about the medicinal uses of the Snow Mountain's mist flower. Such a unique medicinal ingredient would be more than enough as a birthday gift for the emperor. Chu Lian pondered it for a bit before nodding. "Luckily, we had one stock left. This gift is much better than presenting some other treasure." Thus, the couple decided on their gift for the emperor's birthday feast. He Changdi saw that she was in higher spirits, so he teased her. Lianer, have you decided on what you're going to give the emperor? Chu Lian showed him a cunning smile. It's much simpler for me. They'll just cook a dish for him and bring it into the palace. He Sanlang poked the tip of her nose in response. He suddenly turned serious and said, once the Thousand Blessings festival is over, we'll move out of this estate. Chu Lian abruptly sat upright with her eyes wide in disbelief. Really? You've already discussed it with father? He Changdi nodded. Chapter 608. Without a cheat. 4. Over these 2 days, he and his father had purged the entire estate. They had also gotten to the truth of why his eldest brother He Changqi had suddenly requested to marry Pan Yanjin, as well as to relinquish his position as heir to He Changjue. It turned out that eldest Madame He Ying and Pan Yanjin had had a private discussion with He Changqi. They had told him that he was ruining their family's reputation with his actions, and that He Ying would spread the entire matter out to society and bring down the name of House Jingon if he didn't take Pan Yanjin as his wife. Driven into a corner, He Changqi had made that decision in despair. He Changdi had already discussed with Count Jingon and come up with a solution. They were going to send He Ying and her daughter off to one of House Jingan's rural holdings and keep them there under guard. They were also going to rotate the servants in Qingxi Hall out, so as to prevent any incidents from happening again. Now that Count Jingon was back, it was time to bring forward He Chang's engagement. Since eldest brother He Changqi had just divorced, there wasn't a need to find a second wife for him so quickly. Once second brother took a wife, it wouldn't be good for him to stay on in the estate, since he had his own noble title. Why not leave the estate and make their own home earlier? Especially since his grandmother had something against Chu Lian now, it was better for them to leave the Jingon estate. Actually, Matriarchy was still in the dark about his decision. However, He Changdi had no intention of telling his grandmother until they were ready to move out. Seeing that Sanlang had already made preparations so quickly, Chu Lian felt reassured. Her smile reached her eyes, turning them into crescents. Where are we going to live in the future? Even though Chu Lian had lived in the Great Wu for close to a year, she was still a modern person deep down. She wanted to have her own home with her husband. He Sanlang had already looked at several courtyards outside in secret. He bent down and smiled. Shall we go take a look together soon? Chu Lian happily agreed to it. They didn't lack money right now, so it would be better to choose an estate that they liked. While the gloomy clouds over the He couple had cleared up, there was a storm brewing somewhere else. To the west of the capital, an average-looking carriage stopped outside the walls of an ordinary residence. The blinds of the entrance of the carriage were lifted, and a middle-aged man dressed in gray jumped out. There was a sword hanging at his waist. After exiting the carriage, he respectfully lifted the blinds once again and helped the young man out. The young man had exquisitely handsome looks. If not for the Adam's apple on his throat, he would have been beautifully androgynous. One followed behind Xiao Bojian and whispered into his ear, "Master, this is the place." Once the woman finished speaking, Xiao Bojian felt an important part of his body grasped by a smooth hand. Chapter 609. Thousand Blessings Festival 1. Xiao Bojian's body tensed before immediately relaxing. He gave a seductive groan and turned towards the well-developed, mature woman, pressing her down into the bed. It was another flight of pleasure. 2 hours later, Xiao Bojian was already fully clothed and standing by the well in the courtyard. The woman had already left through the back door, so the only ones left were Xiao Bojian and one. One stood behind Xiao Bojian, his gaze on Xiao Bojian's slim back. He opened his mouth, but stopped himself from saying anything. He wanted to say that it wasn't worth it for Xiao Bojian to do this, as their forces were now incomparable to the past. To accomplish their objective, they didn't have to use that woman. He could tell that his master didn't like that woman. In fact, he could see that he loathed and was disgusted by her. Xiao Bojian looked up at the skies. A moment later, he turned around to glance at one. There was a mocking smile on his face. "I know what you want to say, but you need to know that this is the route with the least losses for us. He Changdi has already gathered up his forces. We don't have enough people to go head-to-head against them." This was the type of person Xiao Bojian was. He had wild ambitions, and he took extreme actions. In order to achieve his goals, he was willing to sell even himself out. With power and revenge laid out in front of him, he had lost all sense of self-preservation. Xiao Bojian's eyes narrowed. Before the Northern Army's overwhelming victory against the Tuhan people, he had never thought that the person who would stand toe-to-toe with him would be House Jinggan's He Changdi. It turned out that he had been severely underestimating this man all this time. On the 20th of March, with his personal bodyguards and the family soldiers, Count Jinggan personally escorted He Ying and her daughter to one of their rural estates in the outskirts of the capital and assigned the family soldiers to keep watch over them. Matriarch He had argued with Count Jinggan over this matter, but since Count Jinggan had already made up his mind, nothing the matriarch said had any effect. This matter had angered Matriarch He to the point that she became bedridden. But despite this, all Count Jinggan did was instruct the servants in Qingxi Hall to take proper care of the matriarch. Due to He Changdi and Count Jinggan's contributions to the public accounts, all expenditure in the estate was also now in order. As there were only a few family members living in the estate, it wasn't as tiresome to manage the Jinggan estate as it was for other noble estates. With the help of her close aides, Countess Jinggan was able to cope with managing the household now. He Changdi had already discussed the matter of moving out to his own manor with his father. Count Jinggan and He Changdi then wrote letters to the Chengping Emperor to request his permission. Countess Jinggan may have agreed to this, but she still asked He Sanlang to pick a place that wasn't too far from House Jinggan. During their 2 days of free time, Chu Lian and He Changdi went to take a look at a few suitable estates. They were pretty much set on the one at Pinkong Lane. Now they were just waiting for the Emperor's permission. The moment the Emperor sent over the red letter of approval, the two could move out. In a room within Qingxi Hall, Mu Xiang had just learned the news of the third branch moving out. She first felt overwhelmed, then disbelief. In her enraged confusion, she knocked over the table beside her chaise. Tea and fruits were strewn over the ground, turning the room into a complete mess. The maidservant on watch outside the door was frightened by the sounds, so she ran in. "Sister Mu Xiang, what happened?" The young maidservant was shocked still by Muxiang's terrifying expression. With that sinister look on her face, Mu Xiang shouted at the servant, "Get out!" Scram! The servant was extremely frightened. When she returned to her senses, she ran away in a hurry with fear written all over her face. She even forgot to close the door on her way out. Senior servant Liu had been instructing some servants as they laid out beddings and other items to dry in the sun. Seeing a flustered servant running towards her, she immediately criticized her. "Watch yourself. You should know better than to run about like that." The servant stopped in her tracks, then nervously bowed to Senior Servant Liu. Senior Servant Liu sized up the young servant, who looked to be around 14. If she recalled correctly, this servant usually stayed by Muxiang's side and worked for her. Mu Xiang often had this servant run errands for her. Why did she look so scared? She had run over here from Muxiang's room. Unable to keep her emotions under control, the servant sobbed and tears began to fall from her eyes. "Momo, something seems to have happened to Sister Mu Xiang. Please take a look at her." Senior Servant Liu was startled by this exclamation, but she put on a serious expression and said, all right. And here I thought something serious had actually happened. You should go take a rest and wash your face. I'll go have a look. If you act rashly like this again, be prepared for the rod." Understood. The servant withheld her tears and carefully left. Senior Servant Liu personally went over to Muxiang's room. The doors were open, so Senior Servant Liu was immediately able to see the disheveled state of the room when she walked up to it. Before she could even speak a word, she suddenly heard Muxiang's frigid warning. "Didn't I ask you to get the hell out?" Scram! Senior Servant Liu frowned and fiercely rebuked her. "What's wrong? Am I not allowed to check on you?" As she hadn't been expecting Senior Servant Liu at the door, the expression on Muxiang's face was priceless. She immediately became flustered, but she managed to calm down very quickly. Mu Xiang readjusted her facial expression before turning to walk towards Senior Servant Liu. She appeared apologetic and fearful as if she had committed some wrong and said, "Momo, Why are you here? I didn't know that it was you who came. I thought it was that careless girl. Senior servant Lu let Mu Xiang help her over to a chair before surveying the messy sofa and floor. What's going on? Why is the room in such a mess? Mu Xiang pursed her lips in embarrassment. Momo, it's all my fault. I was lost in my thoughts while sitting on the chaise and I knocked over the teapot and fruit platter on the table by accident. The young maidservant keeping watch outside thought something had happened and rushed in. I was in a bad mood, so I gave her a little scolding. That girl only came to the estate a short while ago and is a little too sensitive, so she ran away just from that. Chapter 610, Thousand Blessings Festival 2. Senior servant Lu found her explanation to be rather reasonable, so she didn't linger on that topic. She looked at Mu Xiang and said, "What's up with you these days? Why have you become so absent-minded? If you're like this, how can I trust you to take care of the matriarch properly?" Although Mu Xiang truly despised senior servant Lu inside, she didn't let that show at all. She held senior servant Liu's elbow in an intimate motion and said with a smile, "Momo, I'll admit, I haven't been performing well for the past few days. From now on, I will definitely put my heart and soul into serving the matriarch." Senior servant Lu sighed and patted the back of Muxiang's palm. "You're getting older now, having spent 8 years serving by the matriarch's side. 2 days ago, the matriarch even talked to me about you. Don't worry, the matriarch thinks of you like a granddaughter, so as long as she's around, you will be treated well." Mu Xiang nodded bashfully and personally walked senior servant Lu to the door. As senior servant Liu's silhouette disappeared into the distance, Muxiang's face returned to that of gloominess and malevolence. She was stuck serving the matriarch in Qingxi Hall, so it was rare enough for her to meet He Sanlang. If he moved out, the likelihood of her seeing him again was close to zero. Just what should she do? After departing from Muxiang's residence, senior servant Lu suddenly stopped by a crabapple tree. She turned her body slightly to ask the person beside her, "How have you been feeling about Mu Xiang recently?" The two maidservants following behind senior servant Lu looked at each other, then answered honestly, "Momo, with all due respect, Sister Muxiang's temper doesn't seem to be as good as in the past." They were already being extremely tactful with their wording. Mu Xiang had served the matriarch for many years, and she was known for having a good temper and being conscientious. The matriarch liked her very much. In the past, she had helped senior servant Lu with managing the servants of Qingxi Hall, and she had never made any mistakes. Moreover, due to Muxiang's great personality and the fact that she never lost her temper, the new maidservants all enjoyed working under her. However, in the past 2 months, Muxiang's temper had suddenly become rather short and violent. The servants working under her had been scolded to tears on multiple occasions. This was something that would have never happened in the past. Senior servant Lu nodded, looking thoughtful. Moments later, she said, "From now on, pay more attention to Mu Xiang. Try to figure out what has happened to her." The servants acknowledged the order in unison. March 23rd, the day of the Thousand Blessings Festival. As it was the Chengping Emperor's birthday, there was no morning court held today. All officials from the 4th rank and up, as well as any titled nobles, were required to attend the palace's banquet in the evening. Female guests would be received separately by the empress. As matriarch he wasn't well, she didn't intend to attend the banquet. Other than the matriarch, all the other masters of House Jinggan would be in attendance. When it was time, Count Jinggan held Countess Jinggan's arm as they led their sons, He Changqi and He Changdi, and their daughter-in-law, Chu Lian, onto the carriages that had been prepared. He Erlang had been transferred to the Imperial Guards, so he had to stay in the palace today as part of the security detail. Thus, he hadn't returned to the estate. As it was a special day, everyone rode in carriages. When they reached Zhuke Gate, everyone would have to get off the carriage and enter the palace on foot. After passing Taishan Gate, male and female guests would be separated. The banquet held for the officials and noblemen would be in Waman Hall, while their wives and other female guests would proceed to the Imperial Garden in the inner palace. House Jinggan's entourage to the palace consisted of 3 carriages. The leading carriage was occupied by Count Jinggan and his wife. The middle carriage was occupied by He Changqi. He Changdi and Chu Lian sat in the last carriage. Chu Lian and He Changdi were wearing brand new clothes today. He Changdi was dressed in a sapphire blue robe with floral embroidery and silver accents. He also wore a matching cape and a marquee crown. He Changdi's eyes were shut as he rested in the carriage. The skies had already begun to darken outside, and only the gentle light of dusk made it into the carriage. Taking advantage of this light, Chu Lian raised her chin to stare at the side of He Changdi's face. As she watched him, she began to laugh. He Sanlang seemed to have heard her suppressed laughter, so he raised the curtains and stared at her. Chu Lian wore a long, silver-lined red dress made out of brocade. The upper half of it was a form-fitting top, covered in a light purple vest with silver accents and half-length sleeves. The vest ended at her waist, which was just right to show off the complicated embroidery of the bottom half of the dress. There was a matching thin red and silver shawl draped at her elbows and hanging down the back of her dress. Two interesting-looking bracelets, made out of red coral, were on her wrists. Their vibrant red color made for a stark contrast against the pale white of her arms and was very eye-catching. As she was already dressed so extravagantly, Chu Lian told Xian to style her hair into a simple bun. The only accessory on her hair was a white jade hairpin with a ruby inlay. There was also a ruby hanging in the middle of her forehead. Contrasted against her skin, the ruby helped her skin look all the more fair and beautiful. Today, Chu Lian's bangs had all been combed away to show off every flawless bit of her forehead. Her beautiful oval face helped to emphasize her bright and clear almond eyes. The moment He Changdi opened his eyes, he was greeted with the breathtaking beauty of his wife. Chu Lian's eyes were currently in the shape of crescent moons, accompanied by a wide smile on her face as she looked at him. He Changdi felt the impulse to hide this beautifully dressed woman away, so that no other man would receive such a feast for the eyes. Chapter 611, Thousand Blessings Festival 3. He Changdi had his hands on his knees as he rubbed the green jade ring on his thumb. Chu Lian was also wearing a smaller-sized ring like his on her left hand. When Chu Lian noticed He Changdi's gaze directed at her, her smile brightened even more. He Sanlang raised his brows a little. In a charming voice he said, "What are you smiling at?" Chu Lian tilted her head. He Sanlang had an originally frosty disposition, but his experience as part of the Northern Army had given him a trace of a military man's air. His face was incomparably suave. He had well-defined features, a tall nose, and a pair of dark eyes which were incredibly captivating. He was like a frigid iceberg in the midst of a raging storm, and anyone who accidentally wandered into his reach would never be able to break away. Learning from him, Chu Lian raised her eyebrows as well and said, "He Changdi, I don't notice it normally, but you're pretty handsome now." He Changdi had refined facial features, and his skin was fairer than most men. His figure looked like it was sculpted by the gods. He had truly received the best traits of both Countess Jingon and Count Jingon. She hadn't felt much about it at all when she was reading the novel, but now that she could see him with her own eyes and he had become her husband, she was overwhelmed by the difference. Despite his thick skin, there was no way He Changdi could stay stoic against his wife's unbridled praise. Although he didn't show it on his face, his ears reddened a little. As they spent their days together, Chu Lian had already become more aware of the minute changes in his expression, so she snickered inwardly. Actually, He Changdi was still very innocent in some ways. He Changdi didn't speak a word and pursed his lips. From a bystander's point of view, it was like his face had become even grimer, perhaps bordering on enraged, but that wasn't actually what happened. He was just shy and embarrassed. Chu Lian was incredibly entertained. She wanted to tease him more. The two sat facing each other with half an arm's distance between them. He Sanlang could reach Chu Lian just by straightening his long legs. She leaned forward slightly and blinked her wide almond eyes at him. "He Changdi, your ears are red." Once she said that, she moved back like a child who had just received a treat and began to laugh while covering her mouth. A twitch developed on He Changdi's forehead. Taking advantage of the fact that Chu Lian had her guard down, he reached forward and caught her, pulling her over to his side and making her sit beside him. Still in the middle of laughing, Chu Lian was startled by his sudden, overbearing action. Before she had the chance to relax, her small mouth was sealed by a pair of ice-cold lips and her mouth was plundered. Chu Lian's eyes widened. She subconsciously resisted by pushing away the strong man with both hands. Chapter 612, Thousand Blessings Festival 4. He Changdi tucked some stray locks of hair behind Chu Lian's ear before sweeping aside the curtains of the carriage and looking outside. The path had indeed been blocked by the numerous carriages of other families. They were all crowding over at Zhuke Gate. It also just so happened that House Zheng's carriage was right next to theirs. When he turned, he noticed that Heir Zheng was about to disembark his carriage. Heir Zheng noticed the couple as well, and took the initiative to greet them. Markiana, honored Lady Jeannie, it's been a while. He Changdi nodded towards Heir Zheng with a chilly and unsociable countenance, while Chu Lian smiled at Heir Zheng and returned the greeting. Heir Zheng seemed to have something to say as his mouth opened, but before he could speak a word, He Changdi let the curtains of their carriage back down. Chu Lian, Heir Zheng. Chu Lian looked speechlessly at her lunatic husband. She softly said, "What are you doing?" Heir Zheng obviously wanted to speak. "Can't you put the curtain back down after the conversation is over?" He Changdi coldly turned his head to face Chu Lian and asked, "What rank are you now?" Chu Lian was flabbergasted. This fellow was changing topics too quickly. He hadn't even answered her question, yet he had already presented her with another. A second-rank Marchioness. Chu Lian subconsciously answered. Although she was still Honored Lady Jeannie, and it was a title bestowed by the Emperor, the Honored Lady title was merely a fifth-rank title. It was a far cry from a second-ranked Marchioness. Thus, when in gatherings in the palace or daily social interactions, she would automatically assume the title with the highest rank. Therefore, Chu Lian was attending the banquet in the palace with her status as Marchioness Anyuan, and not Honored Lady Jenny. He Changda's tone became increasingly displeased. "What did he just call you? Honored Lady Jeannie?" Chu Lian. She had finally learned why this lunatic He Sanlang was being so rude. It was because he didn't like how others addressed her. Heir Zheng hadn't done it on purpose, right? Maybe he had just called her Honored Lady Jeannie out of habit. Chu Lian glared at him. Their carriage was well and truly stuck here. They had no choice but to get off. He Changdi first leapt off the carriage, then supported Chu Lian as she got down by stepping on a stool. Hidden by the wide sleeves of his robes, He Sanlang held Chu Lian's little hand as they walked towards Count Jingan's carriage. One was tall and wide while the other was short and slender, so they looked strangely matching when they stood together. What He Sanlang and Chu Lian didn't know was that Xiao Bojian was nearby and looking in their direction with his hands behind his back. He had a sinister expression on as he looked at He Changdi with jealousy and hatred. The informant pointed at the hall's entrance, lowered his head, and timidly said, "Royal Princess, sir, he is inside." Royal Princess Duanjia looked at the doors with suspicion. Her gaze shifted to the servant before her. The servant trembled, lowering his head even more. This servant wouldn't dare lie to you, Royal Princess." In the end, Royal Princess Duanjia's worry had taken over her rationality, so she turned and walked towards the entrance. She raised her hands and pushed. The doors opened with a long creak. There was a single oil lamp illuminating the hall, its warm light swaying gently. From where Royal Princess Duanjia stood, she could see that deeper within was a room with a bed inside, its curtains drawn to reveal a man lying on top. The man was dressed in a guard's attire, with a broad-looking back and a tall figure. On his waist was a familiar jade token with a blessing for success engraved on it. Royal Princess Duanjia squinted. This figure looked too familiar. It had to be He Erlang. While Royal Princess Duanjia was feeling overwhelmed to the point of disbelief, she suddenly heard a short groan behind her. Jinxiu couldn't even complete the sound. She was quickly cut off, and before Royal Princess Duanjia could react, the doors of the hall slammed shut. Royal Princess Duanjia's whole body trembled. She was too shocked to think. She quickly ran back to the door and banged on it with her fist, but no matter how much she screamed, There was no reply from outside. After recovering from her panic, Duanjia regained a little of her rationality. Many thoughts flitted through her mind as she tried to think of what to do, but she couldn't come up with any good ideas, trapped as she was. She recalled the various methods that Chu Lian had used to save her at Defeng Tea House. However, her eyes abruptly reddened at the reminder that she didn't have Chu Lian here with her. She rubbed away the tears that welled up. Thinking about what she had caught a glimpse of deeper within the hall, she took a deep breath and walked towards the inner room. The person lying on the bed was definitely He Erlang. She was absolutely certain of it. Royal Princess Duanjia walked over to the bed. The man was facing away from her, so she tried to carefully turn him over. There was no reaction. Duanjia tried again. In the end, she was forced to use all her strength to turn the man over. Borrowing the dim light from the single lamp in the room, Royal Princess Duanjia managed to confirm that this was indeed House Jinggan's second young master, He Changjue. After a closer examination, He Changjue was currently unconscious. There were droplets of sweat on his forehead, and his lips were red. His incredibly manly, rugged face was also a little flushed. Even though they both liked each other and had seen each other in private a few times, they hadn't progressed very far. They only maintained a very cordial relationship on the surface and had never taken the next step. They never did anything that was out of the ordinary between friends. A situation like this where they were in a room together with no one else had never happened before, and to add on to that, He Erlang was unconscious. Royal Princess Duanjia tapped He Changjue on the cheek, but the sleeping He Erlang didn't show any signs of waking up. Royal Princess Duanjia frowned. She got up and glanced at the table. All of a sudden, an idea popped up in her head. She poured cold water into a teacup, carried it to the bed, and tossed the contents onto He Changju's face. The bone-piercing chill of the water finally got a reaction out of He Erlang. He slowly opened his eyes, but they took some time to focus due to the headache he had. His vision was a complete blur. He swung his head from side to side, then pressed on several acupoints on his body. He rubbed his temples one more time. A few moments later, He Changjue was finally able to see what was in front of him. Once his vision cleared up, he immediately caught sight of Royal Princess Duanjia, who sat beside him. He Erlang gaped. He stuttered a little as he asked, Princess? Chapter 614. Phoenix Trap 2. Seeing that He Erlang had finally woken up, Royal Princess Duanjia could finally set her worries to rest. However, on the outside, she haughtily raised her chin at him. She sneered and said, "So you still recognize that it's me? Huh? He Erlang, if I wasn't here, you would have likely been sold off into slavery without even knowing." Royal Princess Duanjia glared as she scolded He Erlang. Even her hands were subconsciously placed on her waist, as if that could make her look more intimidating. As his vision cleared, He Chang's mind also cleared up. Something in his field of view caught his attention. He squinted at it, then got up and poured all of the teapot's cold water onto that thing. A hissing sound resounded in the room, followed by a small amount of green smoke. The incense burner had been extinguished. Royal Princess Duanjia was completely caught off guard by his sudden action and dropped the haughty attitude that she had been taking. Shocked and slightly frightened, she asked, "What's wrong?" "There's something wrong with this incense." Huh? With widened eyes, Royal Princess Duanjia's attention shifted towards the octagonal incense pot. He Changjue pulled Royal Princess Duanjia to his side. "Don't get too close to it. I don't know if it has any effect on women." He Changju's tug made Duanjia stumble. She nearly fell into his embrace, which made her blush. She clenched the hems of her sleeves tightly before asking, "Were you unable to wake up because of that incense?" He Changjue nodded. This was a special type of incense. It usually caused no harm, and it was even good for the body. However, if a man were to drink a specially concocted wine beforehand, the scent would cause him to faint and stimulate his lustful desires. He had heard people talking about it back in the Dragon Guard, but he had never actually seen it. He never expected that he would be on the receiving end of it today. He Changjue had been on duty today. He had been leading his men on patrol around the Imperial Gardens, but he had been lured by a figure in black to this unused palace hall. By the time he entered the room and caught a whiff of the incense, it was already too late for him to do anything. Fortunately, Royal Princess Duanjia managed to wake him up by dousing cold water over his face. Otherwise, no matter how much she shouted, he would have been useless. Even if he were woken up, he would have turned into an uncontrollable, lustful fiend if he continued breathing in the incense. Since he had managed to extinguish it early, he wasn't too affected. Right now, he just felt an uncomfortable heat inside, and little Erlang was trying to show its presence, but this was still at a bearable level for him. As the room was dimly lit, it was most likely that Duanjia wouldn't notice the change in his body that was out of his control. Erlang helped Royal Princess Duanjia up. He thought about the situation and realized that they had walked straight into a trap. Royal Princess Duanjia sat up straight, while Erlang stayed right beside her. She seemed to be able to smell He Changju's distinctively manly scent all around her. He Changjue took off his cloak and covered Duanjia's shoulders with it before asking, "Where are your servants?" Royal Princess Duanjia couldn't possibly have come here just by herself. Even if someone had deliberately baited her to come, she couldn't possibly have come without a single servant. "She's been taken down," Royal Princess Duanjia said calmly, but He Changjue could tell that she was actually worried inside. Erlang recalled the maid who frequently helped to deliver letters between the two of them. He reached out with the intention to console Duanjia by stroking her head, but then at the last minute, he recalled the fact that there was no official relationship between them and awkwardly retracted his hand. "She should be fine. I was their target, so that girl's life shouldn't be at risk." Royal Princess Duanjia glanced at him and twisted her lips to one side. "What should we do next?" He changed, his pupils shrunk. "Let's wait and see. I want to see just who is trying to plot against me." Royal Princess Duanjia was frightened by the abrupt change in his expression. The ferocious snarl on his face made her mind go blank. She had never known that Erlang could be so decisive and authoritative. A slight smile subconsciously formed on her lips. This man was becoming more and more attractive to her. While He Changjue was lost in his thoughts, Royal Princess Duanjia unscrupulously inspected his body. The two of them had never been so close to each other before. She could touch the large palm he had placed on the bedside just by reaching out. His hand was huge. Just judging from what she could see, it seemed to be twice the size of hers. His fingers were long, and if he spread his palm out and she put her hand on it, he would probably be able to wrap over her entire hand. There were some fine hairs on the back of his hand. His skin wasn't very dark, but its color looked very manly. At the very least, it was completely different from hers, which was soft and tender. Despite being in a dangerous situation like this, Royal Princess Duanjia's heart was overflowing with happiness because she was slowly discovering the tiny differences between their bodies. Her line of sight shifted a little, and her eyes immediately widened. Her face grew red and she turned away. She couldn't continue letting her gaze roam over him anymore. Feeling that Duanjia's gaze had finally shifted away, Erlang was finally able to relax. Usually, he wouldn't mind her looking at all. It wasn't as if he would lose something if she stared. Besides, she was the person he liked. However, the current situation was different. He was in an awkward state due to the incense which had triggered something in his body which he couldn't control. He Changjue shifted a little to get more comfortable, trying to hide his uncomfortable bulge. Right as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard some sounds coming from the outside. Chu Lian and Wenqing had arrived. Chapter 6:15. Phoenix Trap 3. Chu Lian frowned as she looked at her surroundings. Darkness had enveloped the shining palace. This place was so cold and deserted that there wasn't a single maid or eunuch watching the door. She softly asked Wenqing, who was beside her, "Are you sure this is the place?" Wenqing nodded in confirmation. "Third young madam, this is the place. I saw the princess walk in this direction with my own eyes." The senses of martial arts practitioners were sharper than most people. Even Wenqing's eyesight was better than Chu Lian's. In this dark night lacking of any light, Wenqing was able to see things more clearly than Chu Lian. Chu Lian's gaze shifted to the shut doors in front of her. Did the princess go in there? Wenqing shook her head. I did see the princess walking in this direction, but I don't know whether she entered the hall or not. There was only a single alley going in this direction from the Imperial Gardens, so it had to be somewhere here. Chu Lian's brows creased together tightly. She was in the middle of deciding whether to take a look inside. When Wenqing made a suggestion, "Third young madam, it's better if we wait. This is the Imperial Palace. Princess Wei will send people here soon." Chu Lian nodded. She couldn't confirm whether Royal Princess Duanjia had been set up and whether she was in danger. What if it turned out to be a multi-layered trap? She couldn't just jump right into it and get caught herself. The inner palace had never been a place with rules or morals. Furthermore, she didn't know what would happen if she went in and what dangers she might face, so it was better to take the safer option. He Erlang and Royal Princess Duanjia had been carefully observing the outside. When they realized that the person who had come was Chu Lian, Duanjia's eyes brightened. She was about to open the windows and call out to her, but before she had the chance to, He Changjue covered her mouth. "Be quiet, there's someone else coming." Sure enough, the moment He Erlang whispered this to her, two men had walked out from the darkness. The man who stood in front was very young. He wore a black brocade robe, and he had a tall and slender physique. It wasn't until he stepped into a lit area that Duanjia was able to identify him. He Erlang fixed his gaze upon the beautiful man beyond the doors and made sure not to miss a single movement or expression on his face. Xiao Bojian leisurely walked out from the darkness, with one following behind like a shadow. Chu Lian looked up and noticed the man. When she realized who it was, she had the urge to curse at the heavens. This damned Xiao Bojian was way too clingy. He truly lived up to his role as the male lead in the original novel. Was he forcibly increasing his screen time? Xiao Bojian's black robe was low profile but luxurious. One just had to look at the patterns on it to tell that it had been made of an exceptional quality fabric. It was unfortunate that such a great cut of cloth had been wasted on him. A robe like this would definitely look a lot better on He Changdi instead. Chu Lian quickly cleared away these random thoughts in her head. She raised her chin a little, facing the man coming towards her with a frown. Wenqing hadn't expected Xiao Bojian to appear at a time like this. She quickly took a step forward to protect Chu Lian and took up a ready position to prepare herself. If Xiao Bojian made any moves, she would immediately attack him. Unfortunately, Xiao Bojian completely ignored Wenqing's protective movements. A faint smile appeared on his lips, and his peach blossom-shaped eyes stared at Chu Lian with ample tenderness and a fragment of resentment. In the next second, Chu Lian heard Xiao Bojian speak, but even before he spoke a word, she already had goosebumps all over. "Lianer, you're finally willing to see me." As he said that, he looked even more lovingly at Chu Lian. Chu Lian, what the hell? Had this fellow gone mad since their last meeting? When had she ever been willing to see him, or even try to see him? She had clearly been lured to this place. If Royal Princess Duanjia hadn't left suddenly, she wouldn't have been worried about Royal Princess Duanjia's safety, and she wouldn't have come to this remote part of the palace so hastily. Was there a hole in Xiao Bojian's head? Had he been born without a cranium? Chu Lian asked with guarded eyes. "Why are you here?" Xiao Bojian smiled. His gaze became increasingly gentle. However, when such a meek expression appeared on his face, it made people feel uneasy instead. Xiao Bojian seemed like someone who always had a gloomy expression, so this sudden change only made others more wary. "I'm waiting for you." He spoke these words with a gentle smile, like a kidnapper using some chocolate to entice a greedy child. Chu Lian had a look of disgust. Did he think that he could trick her like she was a 3-year-old? "Just what do you want? What happened to the princess? Why have you led me here?" Chu Lian didn't want to beat around the bush with him. If she had the choice, she wouldn't want to spend even a second more around a person like Xiao Bojian. Perhaps noticing the disgust and hatred in Chu Lian's eyes, the gentle smile on Xiao Bojian's face instantly froze up, then cracked and completely fell apart. In the next instant, it was as if he had changed faces. His face became gloomy as hell, and that perfect face now seemed to contain malevolence. His glare locked onto Chu Lian. It seemed as if he wanted to see right Chu Lian and find out what she truly thought. "Lianer, Do you truly not like me anymore? As he said this, pain and regret showed on Xiao Bojian's face. Chapter 616, Phoenix Trap 4. Chu Lian wanted to roll her eyes at him. She felt really wronged. From the very beginning, she had never felt anything for him. All right? Without any mercy, Chu Lian replied, Sir Xiao, you need to know your place. I am Martianess on Yuan, and there is no connection between us. Therefore, there's no need to even mention like or dislike. Xiao Bojian's head tilted down a little. His face was shrouded in darkness, so Chu Lian was unable to see his current expression. A moment later, he raised his head again. The malevolent look on his face had disappeared. All that was left was his usual gloominess. He suddenly spoke, Lianer, do you want to know the truth about your mother, your birth mother? The life of the deceased first wife of House Ying's second master was basically a mystery. The moment second madam had passed on, it was as if nobody in House Ying remembered what she looked like. If it hadn't been for the existence of the sixth Miss, Chu Lian, everyone would have thought that second master hadn't married before. Later on, when Chu Lian had grown up and started to become more aware, there was no one around her who knew anything about her mother. Even senior servant Gue, who was closest to her, only knew a little bit from hearsay. Since young, Chu Lian had wanted to know more about matters regarding her mother, but nobody would tell her. On the other hand, her father, Chu Qizheng, would get angry at the mere mention of Chu Lian's mother. Second master had remarried very quickly, and his new wife treated Chu Lian harshly. Once the new second madam had birthed her own daughter, she would constantly make things difficult for Chu Lian. This only increased Chu Lian's desire to know about her mother she had never gotten to meet. She would often fantasize about how her mother would look like if she were alive, especially when she was being bullied by her stepmother or Miss Yuan. Later on, Xiao Bojian had entered House Ying, and Chu Lian had become friends with him. When the two chatted, Xiao Bojian learned about Chu Lian's wishes to find out more about her mother. The scheming Xiao Bojian had committed this to memory, and today, he had finally found a use for it. If the person who stood in front of him were the real Chu Lian, there was no doubt that she would definitely have become agitated and asked Xiao Bojian about things like what her mother looked like, or her personality, and more. Unfortunately, the Chu Lian right now is already a completely different person. The original Chu Lian's mother had passed away a long time ago, and she didn't care enough to find out about the looks of a dead person. Even if she knew, it wasn't like it would do her any good. As a simple glutton, the current Chu Lian was simply uninterested in finding out other people's secrets and wasn't a particularly curious person. Just as Xiao Bojian thought that victory was within reach and he was excitedly waiting for Chu Lian to take the bait, Chu Lian calmly replied without so much as a ripple in her heart, I don't. In her mind, Chu Lian thought that this was none of her business at all. She'd rather go home earlier and hug he sailing to sleep. It was as if a bucket of icy water had been dumped over Xiao Bojian's head, dousing his excitement. His gloomy and slightly feminine face was filled with disbelief. He couldn't help but ask, What did you say? Chu Lian pouted. My mother died so many years ago, I don't even remember what she looks like, and am not interested in that anymore. Now, tell me where Royal Princess Duanjia is. A contorted expression suddenly appeared on Xiao Bojian's face again. It was unknown whether he had become angry from her words, or if he was enraged by the fact that things hadn't progressed the way he expected. He spoke to Chu Lian with an angry tone. Chu Lian, this clearly wasn't what you said back then. Chu Lian's eyes shifted away a little. She wanted to stall for time. Everyone changes. Even if I wanted to know about it in the past, I am no longer interested now. You. Xiao Bojian was seething with rage. Chu Lian shot a signal at winching with her eyes. Lianer, you've changed. Chu Lian's mouth twitched. Xiao Bojian was too slow. It wasn't just her personality that had changed. She was practically a different person. All right? You don't have to try signaling your servant. With her level of martial arts, she isn't even a match for my guard. Saying that, Xiao Bojian glanced back at the shadow-like one. Two words came out of his mouth. Take her. One moved like a sudden wind. Although Wenqing's martial arts weren't bad, there was still an insurmountable difference between her and one who was specially trained as an assassin. With only a few moves, one had knocked Wenqing unconscious. However, when one was about to grab hold of Chu Lian, he was blocked by a figure who suddenly leapt out of the darkness. One looked at the man who wielded a sword in front of him and stared at the man with disbelief. He Changdi had suddenly appeared with his handsome but grim face and frosty eyes. His chilly gaze fell upon Xiao Bojian, and he spoke with his deep, tantalizing voice, "Xiao Wujing, just where are you trying to take my wife to?" Xiao Bojian gave He Changdi a death stare. He nearly fainted from the force of his fury. His hands, which were at his sides, turned into fists, and he clenched them so much force that the joints turned white. Chapter 617, Phoenix Trap 5. Xiao Bojian couldn't figure out how He Changdi had appeared here so abruptly when he had prepared such a meticulous plan. Moreover, he had impeccable timing. It was as if He Changdi had already anticipated all of this and had only been waiting for him to fall into his trap. Xiao Bojian gnashed his teeth. A sinister glint appeared in his eyes. He glared at He Changdi with his icy gaze, as if he wanted to shred the man in front of him to pieces. However, He Sanlang wasn't a simple man. He was completely indifferent to the murderous intentions within Xiao Bojian's gaze. The two of them waged a silent war with their eyes, nearly causing sparks to fly through the sheer force of their glares. Soon, footsteps could be heard approaching from the distance. Chu Lian felt inwardly relieved. It seemed like the people that Princess Wei sent had arrived. Xiao Bojian had an extremely terrible expression on his face. One slowly retreated to Xiao Bojian's side and whispered something into his ears. After that, he shielded Xiao Bojian by keeping him behind himself. Xiao Bojian realized that his plan for today had been completely ruined. He had already lost the best opportunity to strike. He turned away from the irritating He Changdi and met with Chu Lian's solemn face instead. Before he left, he said, "Lianer, am still true to my words. If you come and find me, I'll tell you the truth." Leaving behind that parting message, Xiao Bojian left without any hesitation under the protection of one. They swiftly disappeared around the corner of the remote palace hall. He Changdi didn't chase after them. Although he was highly skilled in martial arts, if they really fought, he would barely be able to hold his own against one. As a specially trained assassin, one definitely had some hidden skills up his sleeves. If they really engaged in battle right now, he would probably be at a disadvantage. Furthermore, he still needed to protect Chu Lian, so he couldn't risk their own safety. Xiao Bojian seemed to have also predicted He Changdi's thoughts, so he immediately left under one's protection without any intention to fight. The sound of footsteps seems to be getting closer. She could also hear the sound of voices accompanying them from time to time. Chu Lian glanced at He Changdi, who was still standing beside her. "Worried," she said. "Hurry and leave. If someone finds you in the rear court, you'll be punished." Men were prohibited from entering the inner palace without permission. Even princes had to move out of the palace and into their own estates when they came of age, let alone outsiders. He Changdi wasn't one of the imperial guards who were allowed to enter and leave the inner palace freely. However, instead of leaving, He Sanlang pulled his wife closer, then suddenly embraced her with his arms. Chu Lian could feel the gentle kiss he planted on her hair, near her ear. Even Chu Lian didn't know how anxious and tense He Changdi had been when he had been hiding in the shadows earlier. He was afraid that his beloved wife would personally agree to leave with Xiao Bojian. He didn't know when he started having these feelings, but Chu Lian had already occupied the most important place in his heart. If she ever left, his entire heart would be completely emptied. Chu Lian didn't know that so many thoughts had already gone through the mind of the sensitive and thoughtful He Changdi. She exerted some strength and pushed at He Changdi's sturdy chest with her two little hands while saying, "He Changdi, let go of me. The palace servants are almost here. I'm not letting go." He Sanlang actually started to throw one of his fits now, of all times. Chu Lian was on the verge of dying of frustration thanks to him. She whispered angrily, "What do you want?" Damn it, she hadn't gained a husband at all. He was obviously an idiotic, overaged son. "I'll let go if you promise me something," He Changdi requested cunningly. Chu Lian was about to go crazy as she stared at the intersection. She didn't have the time to care about his request, so she hastily agreed and said, "All right, I'll agree to anything you want. I'm begging you, please hurry up and leave." As the group turned the last corner, Changdi swiftly disappeared into the shadows at the last second, giving Chu Lian a heart attack. Chu Lian cursed him in her mind. If she had a weak heart, she would have already gone crazy from the fright. After calming her breathing, Chu Lian turned towards the direction of the new arrivals. 2 palace maidservants in lavender dresses were in the lead, followed by 4 to 5 eunuchs. Wan Lan and senior servant Lan walked beside them. Before the 2 of them had even reached her, they were already anxiously looking in her direction. When she noticed Wenqing lying limply on the ground, Wan Lan widened her eyes in shock and quickly hastened her pace. Senior servant Lan immediately held onto Chu Lian's hand when she arrived in front of her. "Honored lady, are you all right? Were you injured?" Wan Lan promptly kneeled down to examine Wenqing's injuries. Her heart finally relaxed when she noticed that Wenqing had only been knocked unconscious. Chu Lian shook her head. "I'm fine. Momo, send for someone to take a look at my maidservant. She was the one who protected me just now. Otherwise, I would have been hurt." The palace maidservant in the lead immediately asked Chu Lian about what had happened. After hearing senior servant Lan's explanation, Chu found out that palace maidservants who wore lavender dresses were special imperial guards inside the palace. They were trained to protect the consorts and imperial children in the rear court. Their martial arts skills were not inferior to that of the imperial guards who received elite training. It was also the same for the young eunuchs who followed behind them. Chu Lian knew that these people had been sent by Princess Wei, so she told senior servant Lan about everything that had happened, excluding He Chang's disappearance. Senior servant Lan's brows drew together in a frown, and she quickly led the party into the palace hall. Chu Lian was still uncertain whether Royal Princess Duanjia was really inside, but they still had to enter the hall anyway to make certain their guesses. Senior servant Lan served under Princess Wei, so she was the most suitable person to handle this matter. Chapter 618, Phoenix Trap 6. Shortly afterwards, senior servant Lan found Royal Princess Duanjia unconscious within the room. They also found Jinxiu, who had been moved into a dark corner after being knocked unconscious. Senior servant Lan had also brought along a maidservant who was knowledgeable in medicine. After examining Royal Princess Duanjia, she concluded that the princess had only fainted and that there weren't any other problems with her. Senior servant Lan was finally relieved after hearing her confirmation. By this time, Royal Princess Duanjia and Jinxiu had both regained consciousness. Senior servant Lan couldn't help berating Jinxiu, who had her head lowered as she stood in front of her. "As a maidservant, what were you doing letting the royal princess run around like that?" Royal Princess Duanjia hastily stopped senior servant Lan. "Momo, it was my fault, so don't blame Jinxiu anymore." Senior servant Lan was also familiar with Royal Princess Duanjia's personality, so she could only sigh several times and say, "It was fortunate that honored lady saw you leaving and swiftly notified Princess Wei. If something happened to Royal Princess, then Princess Wei would be heartbroken." Royal Princess Duanjia's eyes lit up when she heard senior servant Lan mention Chu Lian. She quickly asked, "Chu Lu is here too?" Senior servant Lan helplessly nodded. "Honored lady is in the outer room." Royal Princess Duanjia wanted to jump off the bed just as senior servant Lan finished speaking, but senior servant Lan stopped her. "Royal Princess, your body is still weak after we treated you with the antidote for that sedative. You can't get out of bed and walk right now. Momo, tell Chu Lu to come in." Senior servant Lan didn't have any other choice, so she went out to inform Chu Lian of the summons. A moment later, Chu Lian entered the room. Royal Princess Duanjia was leaning on the chaise with a thin blanket covering her legs. Her eyes glimmered when she saw Chu Lian entering. She hastily dismissed the palace maidservants in the room. By the time Chu Lian sat on the chaise, she and Royal Princess Duanjia were alone there. Before Chu Lian was able to speak, Royal Princess Duanjia was already pulling on her arm. "Chu Lu, come with me." Chu Lian responded with a confused "ah." She didn't understand Royal Princess Duangia's intentions. What was she trying to do? Her body was still weak from the drug. After breathing in a sedative and then taking the antidote, a normal person would feel weak for some time. Even their legs would be unstable when walking. Where did Royal Princess Duanjia want to go at this time? Royal Princess, stop joking around. Chu Lian gave her a glare. Chu Lu, I'm not kidding. Are you coming with me or not? As Royal Princess Duanjia spoke, she placed her hands on her hips. She disregarded Chu Lian's objection and got up from the chaise. Chu Lian noticed that she was healthy and energetic. She didn't seem to be feeling weak at all. Shocked, she asked, Royal Princess, you're completely fine? Royal Princess Duanjia nodded and tugged Chu Lian towards the window. Chu Lian watched as she carefully opened the window and leaned outside. Royal Princess, what are you doing? Royal Princess Duanjia pulled Chu Lian to one side, then shook her arm endearingly. My dearest Chu Lu, can you help me keep a lookout? I need to go out for a moment. Chu Lian frowned as she stared at Royal Princess Duanjia. Her eyes were crystal clear. Under the weight of her stare, Royal Princess Duanjia felt like she didn't have anywhere to hide. Thus, her face instantly burned up. All right, Chu Lu, I won't keep it from you. I want to go check on He Changjue. He'll come back really quickly, so help me keep a lookout. Chu Lian was immediately dumbfounded after hearing her words. What? Royal Princess Duanjia was going to look for He Erlang? When had their relationship become so intimate? The gears in Chu Lian's mind swiftly turned. She said, Royal Princess, were you lured to this palace hall because of second brother? Royal Princess Duanjia's face reddened as she nodded, not denying it. With Royal Princess Duanjia's confirmation, Chu Lian understood that something had probably happened to He Erlang. She immediately became anxious. Is second brother all right? Royal Princess Duanjia felt somewhat awkward when she thought about He Changjue. She hastily shook her head. Chu Lu, don't worry. He's fine. Just now, Momo came over too quickly. I still have something to say to him, but I didn't have the time to tell him just now. Chu Lian knew about Royal Princess Duanjia's feelings towards He Changjue, but she hadn't expected their relationship to have reached this stage so suddenly. If this was set during modern times, then it wouldn't really be considered a major issue. At most, they would just date as a couple, which was still a rather pure relationship. However, it was entirely different in the Great Wu dynasty. It was still a period of time when unrelated men and women had to avoid having close relationships. Thus, the relationship between the two of them could already be considered rather scandalous. A royal princess and an imperial guard. The two would rarely have the chance to meet. Chu Lian didn't have the heart to stop them from speaking to each other right now. Under Royal Princess Duanjia's pleading, she could only nod in agreement and promise to help deal with senior servant Lan, who was waiting outside. When Royal Princess Duanjia jumped out of the window, Chu Lian again reminded her to act quickly. Royal Princess Duanjia replied with her guarantee. Once out of the room, Royal Princess Duanjia cautiously approached a small room in the adjoining palace hall. Earlier, she and He Erlang had agreed that she would pretend to be unconscious, while he would hide in a small room nearby. Royal Princess Duanjia was in the middle of slowing down her pace as she got closer when she suddenly heard a man's muffled moan. She froze and took a moment to distinguish the voice, only to realize that it belonged to He Changjue. Her cheeks instantly flushed. In her heart, she wondered, what is that man doing inside? Royal Princess Duanjia hastened her steps and swiftly entered the room. When she pulled apart the blinds hanging over the entrance, she witnessed an unforgettable scene. Chapter 619, Phoenix Trap 7. A tall man was leaning against a small chaise beside the bed. The silvery moonlight shone in through the half-opened window, which just happened to provide a clear view of He Changju's current actions. His hand was stuffed deep inside the opening of his guard's attire. The lower part of his robes was moving up and down due to his movement. A thin layer of sweat covered his masculine face. His lips were slightly pursed, and he was trying his best to suppress his heavy pants. As if he had heard something, he spun around to look in Royal Princess Duangia's direction. He Changju's whole body instantly stiffened. In that instant, he Erlang really wanted to find somewhere to bury himself. It was too damned shameful to be seen by the woman he liked while satisfying himself. He wanted to die from embarrassment. He Erlang had a very unsightly expression on his face, and he appeared to be extremely regretful. If someone were to give him a brick right now, he would definitely find a way to kill himself with it. Royal Princess Dunagia was also stupefied. She had originally come to find He Changjue because she had something to say to him. She never expected to witness such a scene. Although she was a single young woman, as someone born in the imperial family, there were certain things that she should naturally know of. She definitely knew what He Erlang had been doing based on his earlier actions. You. Royal Princess Duanjia nervously gulped and was only able to utter a single word. Her face was burning hot. He Erlang shifted his body sideways in an attempt to block Royal Princess Duanjia's line of sight. After that, he silently took out Miss Raiti from his pants. If Miss Raiti could speak, she would surely be crying pitifully. He had breathed in some special fragrance earlier, so his little brother was still very energetic right now and wasn't showing any signs of deflating. He Erlang. The gears in Royal Princess Duanjia's mind turned swiftly. She knew that He Changjue usually acted in a very orderly manner and had a lot of self-control. He didn't seem like a particularly lustful person. Thus, there was only one reason behind this awkward situation. She restrained her nervousness the best she could, but for some unknown reason, there was a vague and strange sense of excitement emerging from within the depths of her heart. She boldly stepped forward and asked in a soft voice, "Is this because of that fragrance?" He Changjue was in an extremely embarrassing state right now, so he didn't notice Royal Princess Duanjia's movement. His ears turned red, the blush extending down to his neck. He let out a light as confirmation. The embarrassed look on the old bachelor's face unexpectedly made Duanjia's heart ache for him. Royal Princess Duanjia had a sudden burst of sympathy when she stared at He Changju's well-defined features. Before He Changjue could react, Royal Princess Duanjia had already sat down beside him. He Changjue had a tall and sturdy figure with long legs. The muscles on his limbs were also very well developed and strong. He was a handsome man with broad shoulders and a slim waist. Royal Princess Duanjia was similar in stature with Chu Lian, petite and delicate. Sitting beside He Changjue right now, she appeared like a half-grown child. However, that was just what it looked like on the surface. When taking their current expressions into account, there probably wouldn't be anyone who would continue to think that way. Royal Princess Duanjia continued to move closer to the brawny He Changjue. He Changjue was like a frightened bunny who was being forced to retreat into a corner and trying his best to huddle into a corner. The expression on He Erlang's face was rather amusing. He was both flabbergasted and embarrassed. He reached out to hold Royal Princess Duanjia still by her slender shoulders, but he quickly withdrew his right hand when he recalled what he had just done with it. He stopped Royal Princess Duanjia from getting closer to him with one hand. However, he didn't dare to exert any force because she was a delicate young woman. He could only tell her helplessly, "Royal Princess, I'm fine. You should hurry back, otherwise Princess Wei will be worried." He Erlang's entire face was flushed red. He was really fine. He just had to use his five-fingered maiden to help him vent a few times. After that, the effects of the fragrance would be gone. However, Royal Princess Duanjia didn't act as he expected. Royal Princess Duanjia lifted a brow, giving her feminine face a rare trace of resolution and determination. "No, I'm not leaving. He Erlang, I want to help you." He Changjue. Damn, was she really not doing this on purpose? He Erlang was caught in a dilemma, suffering both physically and mentally. He wanted to scare Royal Princess Duanjia away with a stern face, but he had never thought that she would react this way. It wasn't within his expectations at all. While he was still thinking about how to get rid of this extremely persistent woman, his little brother had already been seized. He Changjue. The veins on his forehead throbbed. Damn it, this woman really wanted to kill him. Chu Lian was becoming increasingly anxious while waiting. 45 minutes had already passed. She anxiously looked towards the window from time to time. Senior servant Lan had already sent someone in to check on them once, but Chu Lian had ordered Wan Lan to make an excuse to stall for time. If Royal Princess Duanjia didn't return soon, then even she wouldn't be able to hide it any longer. Just as Chu Lian was about to send Wan Lan to go search for her, 3 special knocks suddenly sounded from the window. Chu Lian's anxious heart was finally able to settle down. Chapter 620, Phoenix Trap 8. As Chu Lian had expected, Senior Servant Lan sent someone in right after Royal Princess Duanjia came back. Royal Princess, honored lady, let's go. If we leave the banquet for too long, the Empress and Empress Dowager will start asking after you. Chu Lian and Royal Princess Duanjia returned to the banquet together. When Chu Lian finally sat back down in her seat, she could sense a hostile, icy gaze on herself. She lifted her head and was met with an infuriated glare. Chu Lian was slightly stunned. She knew exactly who the owner of those eyes was. Imperial Princess Liao. She hadn't visited the palace in a very long time, so she had almost completely forgotten about this princess. Imperial Princess Liao was Imperial concubine Wei's only child and was originally the emperor's youngest, most favored daughter. However, the emperor had grounded Liao ever since the last time Chu Lian had visited the palace. It was later rumored that she had also been lectured by eldest Princess Royal. Afterwards, there was another rumor that this princess was not as favored as before. However, it was hard to say whether the rumors were true or not. In short, it was true that Princess Liao hadn't left the palace again after that day. It had been rather peaceful within the capital ever since she had been grounded. She was currently sitting beside Imperial concubine Wei, drinking a cup of sweet wine while glaring at her with resentment. Imperial concubine Wei seemed to have noticed something amiss with her daughter's gaze, so she also looked towards Chu Lian. Imperial concubine Wei made eye contact with Chu Lian. She suddenly gave Chu Lian a weird smile, leaving her baffled. What was going on today? First, it was Xiao Bojian and Royal Princess Duanjia. Now, even Imperial concubine Wei was joining in on the fun. They didn't all have to show her that kind of secretive expression. She had enough to eat, warm clothes to wear, and he Sanlang to warm her bed. Therefore, she really wasn't interested in their secrets. Chu Lian felt that everyone she had met today was abnormal. They all had a common problem, which was that they were all crazy. Chu Lian replied with a faint smile, which almost caused Imperial concubine Wei to choke on her frustration. If she could, Imperial concubine Wei would have definitely rushed towards the foolish and cheerful Chu Lian to give her a sound slap. She had just given that girl a mocking look, yet Chu Lian had sent back a happy smile in reply. There must be something wrong with her. Imperial Princess Liao was still too young, so she didn't have her mother's ability to endure. She was ablaze with anger, and she wanted to get up to confront Chu Lian. However, she was promptly held down by Imperial concubine Wei. The banquet held at the Imperial Gardens for the noble wives, Imperial relatives, and the relatives of government officials came to an end under this strange atmosphere. The Empress Dowager had originally wanted to extend the banquet, but a palace maidservant had rushed in and whispered something into the Empress and Empress Dowager's ears. The expressions on the faces of the two women with the highest statuses in the kingdom had instantly changed. This scene had naturally fallen into everyone's eyes, but the people present were mostly noble wives with keen senses. Their first reaction was to remain silent. As a result, the Empress and Empress Dowager were no longer in the mood to continue playing host. The Empress Dowager announced the end of the banquet. Court attendants had been arranged to send these noble women out of the rear court. Chu Lian supported her mother-in-law, Countess Jinggan, as they left with old Duchess Zheng and Lady Yang. As they were leaving, Chu Lian caught a glimpse of consort Liang standing nearby with a palace maidservant supporting her. She suddenly fainted after hearing a palace maidservant's report, causing a wave of commotion. Chu Lian felt a thump of unease when she recalled the Empress and Empress Dowager's expressions at the end of the banquet. Had something happened over at the Qingping Emperor's side in Waman Hall? Consort Liang was the birth mother of the second prince, who was also the current crown prince. Empress Xin didn't have any children, while the favored imperial concubine Wei only had a daughter, Imperial Princess Liao. There were also the third to sixth princes. The third prince had died when he was young. The fourth prince was Prince Jean, who had moved out of the palace. The fifth prince was naturally weak and cowardly, and his birth mother had died early. The last one was sixth prince, who was only 15 years old. For the Empress and Empress Dowager to be so concerned, it must have something to do with one of the princes. Since Consort Liang had fainted, had something happened to the crown prince? No, not necessarily. Prince Jean had also been raised by Consort Liang. Moreover, it was said that she treated him even better than her own son, the crown prince. So, was it Prince Jean who had encountered a mishap? He Changdi and Prince Jean were close friends. If something happened to Prince Jean, then He Changdi would also be implicated. When she thought of this possibility, Chu Lian's entire body felt ice cold. Her hands, which were holding Countess Jingon, also instantly lost their warmth. Too many things had happened tonight. So Chu Lian's mind was on high alert, and she couldn't help quickening her pace. Soon, Countess Jingon had also sensed her anxious feelings. Lianer? Lianer? Countess Jingon had to call out to Chu Lian a few times before she came back to her senses. Chu Lian turned her head and gave her an apologetic look. Mother, I'm so sorry. I was distracted by some thoughts. Countess Jingon looked at her helplessly. Silly child, what are you thinking about? As she spoke, Countess Jingon pulled out her arm and patted Chu Lian's hand to comfort her. The palace is a dangerous place. We'll be all right as long as we abide by the rules, so you don't have to think too much. Look, your father and Sanlang have come to pick us up. When Chu Lian looked up, she saw their men standing together at the bottom of the white marble stairs nearby. Her father-in-law was tall and burly, while He Changdi had the same tall stature with a cool temperament. He Changdi's bottomless gaze seemed to be filled with bright stars when she looked at him, giving her a deep sense of reassurance. Chapter 621. Phoenix Trap 9. It was as if Chu Lian's initial worries had been dispelled the moment she saw He Changdi. After everyone from House Jingon got onto their carriages, Chu Lian sat beside He Changdi and finally had the chance to ask, what happened? Did something happen in Wamin Hall? He Changdi still had a stern expression on his handsome face, but a rare sense of tenderness emerged within his gaze when he looked at his wife. He reached out one slender finger to help Chu Lian tuck a few stray strands of hair behind her ear. After that, he gently caressed Chu Lian's soft earlobe, lingering for a moment. The area around Chu Lian's ears was really sensitive, so she slightly hunkered down into her shoulders. She realized that she couldn't avoid He Changdi's annoying hand, so she could only let him continue. Her delicate earlobe quickly turned red due to the rubbing. Her cheeks also instantly flushed red. The crown prince is in trouble, He Changdi said, quiet and calm like he was discussing something as simple and ordinary as the day's weather. Chu Lian's eyes widened after hearing his words, filling with shock. What? Wasn't the Changping emperor satisfied with the current crown prince, second prince? She had read half of the original novel, which had mentioned that the crown prince's position was stable as the crown prince's birth mother, Consort Liang, wasn't competitive nor scheming. Thus, not only was the emperor satisfied with her, but the Empress Dowager was as well. Furthermore, Consort Liang was also fourth prince's adoptive mother. Chu Lian had a good impression of Consort Liang and the crown prince. Why did the crown prince suddenly cause a problem? Even the Thousand Blessings festival had ended early. Thus, it was evident that this was a major incident. Fourth prince had a close relationship with the crown prince. Would fourth prince get implicated in this matter? He Changdi seemed to have noticed the worry in his wife's gaze. He reached out and lightly pinched Chu Lian's pert nose. His voice was still very composed when he spoke. Don't worry. Fourth prince won't be affected by this. Chu Lian let out a faint sigh of relief. As long as Prince Jean wasn't involved in this, then He Changdi wouldn't get entangled by this matter either. If that was the case, she could rest easy. She wasn't very familiar with Consort Liang or the crown prince, so this matter was none of her business. The young couple sat inside the carriage. After listening to He Changdi's detailed recount of the incident, Chu Lian finally found out what had happened at Waman Hall to cause the emperor to fly into a rage. During the Thousand Blessings Festival, all the government officials in attendance were required to present a gift, and the princes were no exception. After the death of the eldest prince, the second prince had been appointed the title of Crown Prince for several years. Second prince had average skills and abilities, so the court officials had thought that second prince wouldn't be able to maintain his position as the crown prince. However, the idiotic second prince had miraculously been able to secure his status as the crown prince for the past 6 years because of his relations with Consort Liang and fourth prince. It actually wasn't all that surprising. Consort Liang could influence the emperor with her posturing within the palace, while the fourth prince, Prince Jean, acted as a scapegoat for the crown prince in court. Moreover, with the support of a group of court officials backing him, it was no wonder that he had been able to keep his position as the crown prince. However, Consort Liang hadn't been present at the male side of the banquet today. Fourth prince had also decided to stay out of today's incident. Thus, it wasn't surprising that the crown prince had to take responsibility after causing trouble today at the banquet. The trouble had started when the crown prince had presented the emperor with a phoenix. It was supposedly a mystic bird found in Lingnan, and a lot of money had been spent to transport it back. The bird's plumage was as beautiful as fire, and its tail resembled the magnificent spread of a peacock's. It had a golden crown and a mauve-colored beak. There was an orange line traced around its eyes. It looked undeniably noble and gorgeous. Everyone had been stunned as they stared at this mystic bird that had been brought into Wanmin Hall. They all admired the beauty of the mystic bird. The Chengping emperor had also been elated over the present. Although the crown prince had wasted a lot of money and manpower to bring this mystic bird back to the capital, finding this phoenix was an auspicious sign for the Great Wu dynasty. It was even more of a good omen since it had been presented during the Thousand Blessings Festival. People were especially superstitious during the ancient times, so they truly believed in the auspiciousness of this mystic bird. Even the emperor was no exception. It was supposed to be a happy occasion for the emperor and his ministers to witness this propitious mystic bird, but no one would have expected for an accident to occur right in front of everyone's eyes. A palace maidservant in charge of serving drinks accidentally knocked over the teapot she was carrying on her tray. It landed right on the mystic bird, and the floor was instantly covered in a pool of washed-off dye. The Chengping emperor's expression immediately turned grim when he saw it. He ordered someone to examine the bird and found out that it wasn't any sort of mystic bird. It was just a peacock whose feathers had been plucked and dyed. The crown prince had committed the grave crime of deceiving the emperor during the Thousand Blessings Festival. The emperor was infuriated, so he ordered for the crown prince to be taken away and locked up. As second prince was being taken away, he still had a face full of disbelief. In a moment of desperation, he had even called for the fourth prince, Prince Jean, who was sitting near the emperor. However, there wasn't even a single trace of emotion within Prince Jean's blue eyes this time. The crown prince had caused a scandal during the banquet, so there was no way for it to continue. The emperor had been so enraged that he left the banquet in anger. The Thousand Blessings banquet within Wanmin Hall had ended on a sour note. Chu Lian had only witnessed whatever happened after that, which was that someone came over to the Imperial Gardens to report about the incident. Chu Lian's eyes widened in disbelief. Wasn't the crown prince too reckless? He had actually dared to disguise a peacock from Lingnan as a phoenix. Wasn't that absurd? He Changdi lowered his head to look at his wife and slightly shook his head. Although the crown prince's actions are absurd at times, this isn't something that he would do. Chu Lian instantly understood He Sanlang's meaning. You're saying that someone else was behind this? He Changdi hugged Chu Lian. His gaze deepened as he stared into the distance. After a long moment, he nodded. He suddenly asked Chu Lian, "Can you guess who it was?" Chapter 622, Phoenix Trap, 10. Chu Lian's clear, almond-shaped eyes darted from side to side as she thought. Although she usually didn't pay much attention to government affairs, She knew about the general situation within the imperial court. Moreover, she did read the original novel. After pondering for a moment, her eyes twinkled. She lifted one of her fair hands and gestured the number 6 in front of He Changda's eyes. A trace of gratification flashed through He Changda's eyes. This incident was indeed related to Sixth Prince. He knew that his wife didn't like the fighting within the court. She was also usually quite lazy. He had originally thought that Chu Lian wouldn't know anything about these situations, so he was somewhat surprised that she had been able to make a correct guess. How did you guess it? I thought you disliked the fighting and scheming in politics? At this moment, a glimmer of light flashed within He Sanlang's eyes. Chu Lian rolled her eyes at He Changdi without mercy. Of course I want to ignore those bothersome politics and just live leisurely. I just want to eat, sleep, cook delicious food, and earn money all day. Thinking about these things wastes a lot of brain power. But a couple should be united as one. Since you're involved in these complex affairs, I need to have some basic understanding too. If I don't know anything at all, then it'll become a burden to you in the future. Even if I can't support you, I can't drag you down. These days, Chu Lian hadn't just been hiding in the estate and idling around. She had not only been managing the stores and rural estates in her hands, but she had also instructed senior servant Zhong to bring over plenty of books from the outer court's main study. She also had Princess Wei to help her, so she had a general idea about the current political climate. They were going to move out of the estate soon. At that time, she would have to take charge of the entire household. Men were supposedly responsible for working outside, while women managed the household. He Sanlang would be busy with his official duties, so she would have to take care of the interpersonal relationships within the estate and their relationship with the other estates. If she was really ignorant about what was going on in court, then by then, she might really cause trouble for He Changdi. He Changdi was completely stunned. His heart warmed. It seemed like Chu Lian had already done a lot for him without him knowing. Those painful experiences hidden in the depth of his memories had become something that he could slowly forget because of Chu Lian's care and consideration. He tightened his embrace and hugged Chu Lian closer. Her soft, petite body was completely buried in his chest. Chu Lian just blinked her eyes because she was still somewhat confused about He Changda's sudden action. However, she immediately understood when she heard him speak in a low, husky voice beside her ear. Chapter 623. Chapter 622. Phoenix Trap 11. Consort Liang was sent back to Chengxiang Hall. She hadn't slept yet when she was informed about the emperor going over to imperial concubine Weiss Hall. Consort Liang had always appeared virtuous and easygoing, but her expression now instantly turned spiteful. She summoned her trusted handmaid in a low voice. Consort Liang's voice took on an especially somber tone. How did Fourth Prince act today? Her handmaid didn't hide anything. Replying to Consort Liang, at that time, Fourth Prince didn't have any reaction at all. He just watched as my son was dragged away. Her handmaid didn't reply, which was a silent confirmation to her question. Consort Liang suddenly knocked over everything on the table beside her. The teacup and snacks all rolled down to the floor, making a loud clattering sound. Consort Liang began to rave like mad. That little bastard! How dare he? How dare he do that to my son, Asheng? Sister, why did you give birth to such an ungrateful bastard? None of the maidservants in Chengxiang Hall dared to speak, because Consort Liang really seemed like a lunatic. Imperial concubine Wei hadn't expected the emperor to come over so late at night. She quickly ordered her attendants to make preparations. The emperor had exploded in anger today at Wamin Hall, and afterwards, he had severely punished the crown prince. Yet, he had still remembered her at this time. Thus, it was quite evident that she held a special place in his heart. When the emperor came over, imperial concubine Wei served him very attentively. It was already very late at night, and the emperor was clearly exhausted, so they just washed up and prepared to sleep. While wearing a loose nightgown, imperial concubine Wei began to massage the emperor as they reclined on the large bed. The emperor would occasionally open his eyes to look at the woman in front of him, but once he closed his eyes, another beautiful smiling face would appear in his mind. Imperial concubine Wei was undeniably the person who resembled Yi Sun the most within the entire imperial harem. This was the reason the emperor would come to spend the night at Imperial concubine Wei's place whenever he felt troubled. It was also the real reason he favored her the most. Imperial concubine Wei was a skilled masseuse. She had specially taken lessons from the palace's most expert senior servants. The emperor was already getting old, so he wasn't very concerned about sex. His only intention was to have a proper night's sleep every time he came over to Imperial concubine Wei's hall. In order to please the emperor, Imperial concubine Wei would often give him massages to help relax his muscles. Imperial concubine Wei was deep in her thoughts while she was massaging him. The crown prince had lost favor now. She also understood that the emperor could no longer tolerate second prince. The second prince didn't show any sense of responsibility that he should have had as the crown prince. The emperor couldn't really pass that esteemed position to a son like him. She only had a daughter, Princess Liao, and she didn't have a son. Even if she wanted a son, the emperor's self-control had improved as he got older. There hadn't been any birth announcements from his concubines for many years. It was only for a short moment, but numerous thoughts had flashed through Imperial concubine Wei's mind. She thought about what her sister, Wei Fengzi, had told her when she visited the palace. Her gaze instantly became determined. She should just sell a favor to the emperor during this critical moment, since there was no hope of a son for her anyways. There was also no true love within the inner palace. Imperial concubine Wei wasn't a complete fool. After all these years, of course she had realized that she was only a substitute for someone else that the emperor wanted in the past. The emperor was lying in bed wearing his imperial yellow robe as Imperial concubine Wei massaged him. Her soft voice suddenly sounded beside his ear. "Your Majesty, do you remember older sister Yi?" As soon as Imperial concubine Wei asked that question, the emperor abruptly sat up and looked at her with a dangerous look in his eyes. Imperial concubine Wei's pale neck was instantly grasped by the emperor's large hand. The emperor was well trained in both brains and brawn. Imperial concubine Wei's neck was already bruised with just one move. "What did you just say?" Imperial concubine Wei stared into the emperor's eyes. She knew without a doubt that if the emperor was dissatisfied with her next words, then she would be carried out as a corpse. A thin layer of cold sweat emerged on Imperial concubine Wei's back. Her eyelashes quivered when she blinked. She took a moment to steady her emotions before answering in a shaky voice. Your Majesty, although Sister Yi has already passed away, she left a child for you." The emperor suddenly narrowed his eyes. "What? Asun was pregnant with his child that year. They actually had a child. His Asun had left a child for him. Tell me, if you dare to hide anything, you should know the result." Imperial concubine Wei's entire body trembled. She didn't dare to hide anything as she said, "Older sister Yes child is honored Lady Jeannie." Jeannie? Chu Lian? House Ying's sixth miss? He Yanwen's third daughter-in-law? That child who had cooked for him that day at Prince Wei's estate? The emperor was stunned to the core. Chu Lian's face immediately emerged in his mind. Even though the emperor had only seen Chu Lian a couple times, he could actually remember Chu Lian's face very clearly at this moment. He instantly connected all the cluttered clues in his mind. The emperor recalled the first time he had seen Chu Lian. At that time, he had felt that her face looked familiar. They didn't meet again for nearly half a year. When he saw her again at Prince Wei's estate, he had mistaken Chu Lian for Duanjia. If she was telling the truth, then these facts could all be properly explained. Chu Lian's mother, Yi Sun, was a distant relative of the Yi family. She could be considered loosely related to Princess Wei as her cousin. If Chu Lian and royal princess Duanjia turned out to be cousins, then there was a reasonable explanation for their similarity in looks. After reaching this conclusion, the emperor unconsciously loosened his grasp. Once he released his hand, Imperial concubine Wei started coughing violently while holding her neck. The emperor had almost strangled her to death. Chapter 624, Phoenix Trap 12. After learning this huge secret, the emperor was no longer in the mood to spend the night at Imperial concubine Weiss' place. Eunuch Wei hastily came in after hearing his loud call. Then, with trembling hands, Eunuch Wei helped the emperor put on his clothes, and they returned to Qingjing Hall. He Lin was summoned to Qingjing Hall in the middle of the night. Go investigate for us. We want to know everything regarding House Ying's original 2nd Madam and 6th Mississippi. He Lin swiftly left Qingjing Hall in fear after receiving his secret order. He was scared that the emperor would kick him out if he didn't move faster. Eunuch Wei, who was waiting on the side, had also already guessed the truth. He was currently deep in his thoughts and very shocked. Honored Lady Jiani was actually the emperor's daughter. Eunuch Wei was in a trance when he suddenly heard the emperor ask, Xiao Haizi, what do you think of Jiani? Wei Qinghai was so scared that he promptly focused all of his attention. At this time, he wouldn't dare say anything bad about Chu Lian. Honored Lady Jiani is intelligent, dignified, and quick-witted. She's also a very talented cook. This servant has never seen a noble lady as special as Honored Lady Jiani. Eunuch Weiss' reply had obviously pleased the emperor. The emperor rubbed his clean-shaven jaw and recalled the first time he met Chu Lian. That little girl hadn't seemed flustered at all even when she was in front of him. She was neither humble nor arrogant. She had been able to think of an unexpected plan to save Duanjia during a dangerous situation. She had also opened a restaurant that was famed throughout the entire capital. There were also the snowboats and her business ideas. How had her little head come up with all those ideas? Why was she so clever and cute? She must have inherited it from him. Asun was also very smart, but she hadn't had such a creative imagination and practical ability. She must have gotten those from him. The emperor momentarily fell into a realm of fantasy. Yi Sun had passed away for many years, and he had always been living in pain. However, he had never expected that Yi Sun would leave a child for him. This child was the continuation of Yi Sun's life and the proof of their love. Jiani was the same age as Duanjia, so she was 16 this year. The emperor made some calculations in his mind. If he and Yi Sun had a child, then the child would be precisely 16 years old. Even before receiving the results from He Lin's investigation, he was nearly certain that Chu Lian was indeed his child. When he thought about it now, it seemed that he liked everything about Chu Lian. However, the smile on the emperor's face froze an instant later. Eunuch Wei, who was standing beside him, was extremely frightened as he observed him. Too many things had happened tonight. Even someone like him, who had experienced numerous upheavals and changes, was a little overwhelmed with shock. When he noticed the change in his master's expression, his legs nearly went limp from the fright. Eunuch Wei summoned up his courage and asked, Your Majesty, are you all right? The emperor had just remembered that Chu Lian had already married someone. Moreover, her husband was He Yanwen's son. So, he was immediately pinned up with anger. It felt like he had just found a long-lost treasure after much difficulty, but the treasure was already engraved with someone else's name because it had been missing for too long. The emperor sneered. That brat got off easy. Eunuch Weiss' face twitched and immediately realized who the emperor was talking about. The person that the emperor was referring to was the current administrator of the Department of Appointments, Ma Qianun. Chu Lian and He Changdi returned to Songtao Court together. They didn't know about the major revelations the ruler of their kingdom was currently experiencing in his seat within the palace. They also didn't know that her body had another identity. He Changdi was relieved that Prince Jin had remained calm and decided not to intervene with the trouble caused by the crown prince today. In his previous life, tonight had been the significant turning point in his close friend's life. The situation had changed now, so He Changdi was in a very good mood. When the couple returned to Songtao Court, it was already late at night. It was a hassle to travel back and forth to the palace to attend the banquet. Moreover, an incident had occurred in the middle of the banquet, so they were both sweating right now. It was necessary for them to change and take a bath. Songtao Court was very big, so there was more than one bathroom. The bathroom in He Changdi's study was even more spacious. Chu Lian sat in front of the dressing table, while Xian helped her remove the hairpins in her hair. After that, she took off the outer robe that she was wearing and finally felt more at ease. When she finished, She noticed that Changdi was still sitting beside the table. She curiously asked, "Why are you still here? I thought you were tired. Why haven't you gone to take a bath?" Changdi held a teacup and took a sip of warm water. He didn't immediately answer Chu Lian's question. Chu Lian thought he wanted her to bathe first, so she happily said, "You should go ahead. I already told Xian to prepare the bath over at the bathroom in the study. All the necessities are already prepared over there, so you don't have to worry." Changdi remained silent even after she said that, so Chu Lian couldn't help turning around and looking towards Changdi. When their eyes met, Chu Lian noticed that there was something wrong with Changdi's gaze. She could see it contained both passion and stubbornness alike. However, that kind of look really didn't match with his icy face. Chu Lian's face instantly flushed because of the way he was looking at her. She stuttered, "Why are you looking at me and not going to the bathroom?" Changdi, who was a miser with his words, finally spoke now. His voice had an alluring magnetism. His chuckle seemed to carry a sense of teasing, which made her heart quiver as he said, "What? Did you forget what you promised me earlier?" You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.